Hello, friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Earl Jacobson had been running freight through the Colorado Rockies for 23 years, and he'd learned to read the mountains like most people read road signs. The way clouds gathered around the peaks meant snow within 6 hours. The particular shade of gray in the sky told you whether you were looking at a dusting or a blizzard. The sound the wind made when it cut through the passes could predict how bad visibility would get. That February morning, as Earl guided his battle-scarred Peterbilt up the approach to Vail Pass, every instinct he'd developed over 2 decades of mountain driving was screaming at him to turn around. The weather forecast had called for light snow, maybe 2 to 3 inches overnight. But the sky above him looked like something out of a disaster movie. Heavy, dark clouds that seemed to be pressing down on the mountains themselves. The wind was gusting hard enough to buffet his 80,000-pound rig, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the past hour. Earl's CB radio crackled with chatter from other drivers, and none of it was good news. "Breaker 19. Anybody got eyes on conditions up ahead? This is southbound Sam, about 5 miles east of the summit. Sam, this is Mile High Mike. Just came through the pass westbound about an hour ago. Snow's picking up fast, visibility dropping. I'd say you got maybe another hour before it gets nasty." "Copy that, Mike. How's the road surface?" "Still passable, but barely. Saw 3 cars spun out on the shoulder, and a state trooper told me they're thinking about shutting her down if it gets much worse." Earl picked up his mic. "This is Mountain Earl eastbound, about 10 miles out from the summit. Any word on closure times?" "Earl, this is Big Sky Betty. DIAT's got crews staging at both ends, but they're not saying when they'll drop the hammer. I'd say if you're not through in the next 2 hours, you might be stuck for the night." Earl checked his GPS and did the math. At his current speed, accounting for the grade and weather conditions, he should be able to clear the pass with time to spare. But that was assuming conditions didn't deteriorate faster than expected. The load in his trailer wasn't particularly time-sensitive, construction materials bound for a job site in Grand Junction. But Earl needed the money. His ex-wife's medical bills from her cancer treatment had eaten through most of his savings, and his daughter was starting her sophomore year at Colorado State in the fall. The tuition payment was due in 3 weeks, and this load would put him just over the amount he needed. Earl had been an independent owner-operator for 15 years, ever since he'd saved enough to buy his first truck. It was a tough way to make a living. No steady paycheck, no company benefits, no backup when things went wrong. But it was his truck, his schedule, his decisions. When the economy was good, he could make decent money. When it was bad, he survived on determination and prayer. The Peterbilt he was driving had been his partner for 8 years. A 2016 model with 450,000 miles on the odometer. It wasn't pretty, but it was reliable. Earl had bought it used from a driver who was retiring, and he'd put every penny he could spare into maintaining it. New engine at 300,000 miles. Transmission rebuild at 400,000. Enough mechanical work to keep 3 shops in business. But mechanical reliability only went so far when you were dealing with Rocky Mountain weather in February. Earl passed a sign indicating 5 miles to the summit, and that's when he saw the first real warning sign. Coming down the eastbound lanes was a convoy of trucks with their hazard lights flashing, the universal signal for stay away. As they passed, Earl could see snow and ice coating their windshields and grills. He grabbed his CB mic again. "Eastbound convoy. This is Mountain Earl. What's it looking like up top?" The response came immediately. "Earl, this is Thunder Road Tom. Turn around, brother. Turn around right now. It's a whiteout up there, winds howling like a banshee, and the road's turning to ice faster than the plows can clear it." "How long you been coming down?" Started descent about 45 minutes ago. Took us an hour and a half to make it through the pass, and that was with chains on all wheels. It's getting worse by the minute." Earl felt his stomach tighten. Tom was a veteran mountain driver with 30 years of experience. If he was telling people to turn around, the conditions had to be genuinely dangerous. But Earl was already committed to the grade. The next place to safely turn around a tractor-trailer was miles behind him, and trying to back down a mountain highway in deteriorating weather would be suicide. "Copy that, Tom. Thanks for the heads up." "Earl, I'm serious. Find a place to hole up and wait this thing out. I've been driving these mountains since before you were born, and I've never seen conditions deteriorate this fast." The line went dead, leaving Earl alone with the sound of his engine and the increasing howl of the wind outside his cab. He passed another sign. "Vale Pass Summit, 3 miles. Chains required beyond this point." Earl pulled into the chain-up area and climbed down from his cab into what felt like the beginning of the end of the world. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face with enough force to sting. The temperature had to be below zero, and the wind chill was making it feel even colder. Earl had been through this routine hundreds of times over the years. Pull the tire chains out of the storage box, lay them out in front of the drive wheels, drive over them, hook them up, tighten them down. In good conditions, it took about 15 minutes. In weather like this, it felt like an hour. By the time Earl finished installing his chains, his hands were numb despite his heavy gloves, and ice was forming on his beard. The snow was falling so hard that he could barely see his own truck, let alone the road ahead. As Earl climbed back into his cab, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. There were other trucks in the chain-up area, but they weren't putting on chains. They were parked with their engines running and their hazard lights on. Drivers were standing outside their cabs talking in small groups, and their body language suggested they were having serious discussions about what to do next. Earl walked over to the nearest group. 3 drivers clustered around a map spread on the hood of a pickup truck. "Afternoon," Earl said. "You gentlemen waiting for the road to open?" One of the drivers, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, looked up. "Road's still open, far as we know. But we've been monitoring the CB traffic, and it sounds like hell up there. DOT's got crews trying to keep it clear, but they're fighting a losing battle." Another driver, younger with a nervous energy, shook his head. "I've got a load of electronics that's worth more than my truck. I'm not risking it in a whiteout." The third driver, who looked like he'd been driving trucks since before Earl was born, pointed to the map. "Thing is, there's nowhere else to go. You can't get to Grand Junction without going over a pass somewhere, and they're all getting hit by the same storm system." Earl studied the map. The old driver was right. The interstate system through the Colorado Rockies was designed with limited alternate routes. If Vale Pass closed, your choices were to backtrack hundreds of miles to go around the mountains, or wait it out wherever you were. "How long you been here?" Earl asked. "About an hour," the gray-bearded driver said. "Name's Clyde, by the way. Clyde Brennan. Been driving these mountains for 15 years, and I've never seen weather move in this fast." "Earl Jacobson. I've been thinking about making a run for it." Clyde shook his head. "I wouldn't. CB chatter says visibility's down to about 50 feet up there. Road surface is solid ice under 6 inches of snow. Even with chains, you're taking your life in your hands." The younger driver looked at his watch. "I've got a delivery scheduled for tomorrow morning in Utah. If I don't make it, better to be alive and late than dead and on time," the old driver said flatly. "I've seen too many good drivers get themselves killed because they thought they could beat Mother Nature." Earl was about to respond when his CB radio crackled to life with an emergency broadcast. All units. This is Colorado Department of Transportation. Be advised that Highway I-70 westbound is now closed from Georgetown to Glenwood Springs due to extreme weather conditions. Repeat, I-70 westbound is closed. Do not attempt to travel through the area." The 4 drivers stared at each other in the sudden silence that followed the announcement. "Well," Clyde said, That settles it. We're stuck here until further notice. Earl felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. The load he was carrying would be late, which meant a smaller paycheck and possibly a black mark with this particular customer. But as he looked around at the deteriorating conditions, he had to admit that Clyde was right. Trying to push through in these conditions would be suicide. "How long do these things usually last?" the younger driver asked. "Could be hours, could be days," the old driver replied. "Mountain weather's unpredictable. Sometimes these storms blow through in a few hours and leave clear skies behind. Sometimes they settle in for a week." Earl walked back to his truck and called his dispatcher to report the delay. As expected, the conversation didn't go well. "Earl, we've got a customer waiting for that material. They've got crews scheduled to start work tomorrow morning." "Jim, the interstate's closed. There's nothing I can do about that." "Can't you take an alternate route? Through a blizzard? In the mountains? Come on, Jim, you know better than that." There was a pause. "The customer's not going to be happy about this." "The customer can be unhappy all they want. I'm not getting myself killed to deliver construction materials a day early." Earl ended the call and settled in for what was obviously going to be a long wait. Outside his windshield, the snow was falling harder than ever. The other trucks in the chain-up area were barely visible through the whiteout conditions. Over the next hour, more trucks arrived at the chain-up area. Some were drivers who'd been traveling westbound like Earl. Others were eastbound drivers who'd tried to make it through the pass and been forced to turn back. By late afternoon, there were nearly 30 trucks lined up along the side of the highway. Earl had gone through this kind of weather delay before, but something about this situation felt different. Maybe it was the speed with which the storm had developed. Maybe it was the unusually large number of trucks that had gotten caught. Or maybe it was just the general atmosphere of tension and frustration that seemed to be building among the stranded drivers. Around 4 o'clock, Earl noticed a figure walking between the trucks. It was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, wearing a heavy winter coat and carrying what appeared to be a thermos and some kind of bag. Earl rolled down his window as she approached his truck. "Excuse me," the woman called out. "Are you the driver of this vehicle?" "Yes, ma'am. Earl Jacobson." "I'm Norma Richardson. I live just up the road about a mile." She gestured toward a cluster of buildings barely visible through the snow. "I wanted to let you drivers know that you're welcome to come up to my place if this situation goes on much longer. I've got hot coffee, warm food, and a place to get out of the cold." Earl was surprised by the offer. "That's very generous of you, ma'am, but I need to stay with my truck." "I understand, but the offer stands. I've lived in these mountains for 45 years, and I know what it's like to be caught in weather like this." Norma looked up at the darkening sky. "This storm's going to get worse before it gets better. A lot worse." Something in her tone made Earl pay closer attention. "What makes you say that?" "I've seen storms like this before. The way the clouds are building, the direction the wind's shifting, the way the animals have been acting for the past few days. This isn't going to be a quick snow shower. This is going to be a significant weather event." Earl could see that Norma was making the same offer to other drivers, and their reactions were mixed. Some seemed grateful for the gesture. Others appeared suspicious, even hostile. Earl couldn't understand why anyone would be hostile toward an elderly woman offering help, but he was beginning to sense an undercurrent of tension among the stranded drivers that he hadn't noticed before. As darkness began to fall, the situation grew more uncomfortable. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and even with their engines running, some of the older trucks were struggling to maintain heat in their cabs. The snow was accumulating so fast that drivers were having to get out every hour or so to clear it away from their exhaust pipes and air intakes. Earl had been monitoring the CB chatter, and the news wasn't good. The storm was affecting the entire central Colorado region. Roads were closing, power lines were coming down, and emergency services were being stretched to their limits. Around 8 o'clock, Earl heard a commotion coming from somewhere up the line of trucks. He could see flashlight beams moving around and hear raised voices, but he couldn't make out what was being said. A few minutes later, Clyde appeared at Earl's window, looking agitated. "You might want to come hear this," Clyde said. "There's something going on up front that you need to know about." Earl grabbed his flashlight and heavy coat and followed Clyde through the snow toward the front of the convoy. A group of about 15 drivers had gathered around one of the trucks, and their conversation was heated. "I'm telling you, this whole thing stinks," a driver Earl didn't recognize was saying. His voice was loud and angry, with a thick accent that suggested he wasn't from Colorado. "Roads don't just close down this fast unless somebody wants them closed." "What's that supposed to mean?" another driver asked. "It means maybe this isn't about weather. Maybe this is about keeping certain trucks from getting to certain places at certain times." Earl looked at Clyde with confusion. "What's he talking about?" "Damned if I know," Clyde replied. "But he's got some of the other drivers pretty worked up." The angry driver continued his rant. "You think it's a coincidence that 30 trucks carrying valuable cargo all got stuck in the same place at the same time? You think it's a coincidence that this storm hit right when it did?" "You're talking about a conspiracy?" an older driver asked skeptically. "I'm talking about reality. There's billions of dollars worth of cargo sitting on this highway right now, and we're all sitting ducks. No communication, no backup, no way to call for help." Earl could see that some of the drivers were actually nodding along with this conspiracy theory. The stress of being stranded, combined with the mounting financial losses, was making people look for someone to blame. "And what about that woman who came around earlier?" the angry driver continued. "How convenient that she just happened to show up offering help. How does she even know we're here? How does she know what kind of cargo we're carrying?" Earl felt his stomach tighten. The driver was talking about Norma, the woman who'd offered them shelter and hot coffee. Earl couldn't understand how anyone could see sinister motives in such a simple act of kindness. But as he looked around at the faces of the other drivers, Earl realized that paranoia was starting to spread through the group like a virus. These were men who were already under financial pressure, who were facing significant losses due to the delay, who were cold and tired and frustrated with their situation. And now someone was giving them a target for their anger. Earl was about to speak up in Norma's defense when the angry driver pointed directly at him. "You," the man said. "You talked to that woman. What did she want to know?" Earl felt every eye in the group focus on him. "She didn't want to know anything. She offered hot coffee and a warm place to wait out the storm." "That's what she told you. But what did she really want? What questions did she ask about your load, your destination, your schedule?" Earl thought back to his brief conversation with Norma. "She didn't ask about any of those things. She just offered help." "So you're working with her?" The accusation hit Earl like a physical blow. "What? That's insane. I never saw that woman before in my life." "Convenient story," the angry driver said. "Real convenient." Earl realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. Paranoia and frustration were feeding on each other, creating a toxic atmosphere that was turning neighbor against neighbor. And he was being targeted as some kind of conspirator simply because he'd been polite to an elderly woman offering assistance. "Look," Earl said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "We're all in the same situation here. We're all losing money, we're all uncomfortable, and we're all frustrated. But turning on each other isn't going to solve anything." "Maybe," the angry driver said. "Or maybe some of us are in a different situation than others. Maybe some of us know more about what's really going on here than we're letting on." Earl could see that about half the drivers were buying into the conspiracy theory, while the other half looked skeptical but uncertain. The group was splitting into factions, and the division was becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. As Earl walked back to his truck through the driving snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The storm was getting worse, the temperature was dropping, and the stranded drivers were becoming increasingly paranoid and hostile. Earl had been through difficult situations before, but he'd never been trapped with a group of people who were starting to turn on each other. And as he settled into his cab for what was obviously going to be a very long night, Earl began to worry that the weather might be the least dangerous thing he had to face. Because when fear and paranoia took hold of a group, people could become capable of things that would horrify them under normal circumstances. And there was nothing normal about being trapped on a mountain highway in a blizzard with millions of dollars worth of cargo and no way to call for help. Earl started his engine to warm up the cab and checked his fuel gauge. He had enough diesel to keep the engine running for maybe 12 hours if he was careful. After that, he'd be at the mercy of the elements and the increasingly unstable group of drivers who were looking for someone to blame for their situation. Outside his windshield, the snow continued to fall with relentless intensity, and somewhere in that white void, Earl could hear the sound of voices raised in anger, getting louder and more hostile with each passing hour. Earl woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of shouting. He'd been dozing fitfully in his sleeper berth, startled awake every hour or so by the wind rocking his truck or the sound of snow sliding off his roof. But this was different. This was human voices raised in anger, carrying across the convoy despite the howling storm. He climbed into the driver's seat and peered out through his windshield. The snow was still falling heavily, but he could make out the glow of flashlights moving between trucks about halfway up the line. The shouting was getting louder, and Earl could hear what sounded like multiple men arguing. Earl grabbed his heavy coat and flashlight and trudged through knee-deep snow toward the disturbance. The cold was brutal, the kind that made your nose hairs freeze instantly and turned your breath into ice crystals. But the sound of the argument was getting more heated, and Earl was worried that whatever was happening might escalate into violence. As he got closer, Earl could make out the voices more clearly. The angry driver from earlier, the one who'd been promoting conspiracy theories, was confronting Clyde and 2 other drivers near Clyde's truck. "I'm telling you, something's not right about this whole situation," the angry driver was saying. His name, Earl had learned, was Danny Morrison, and he was from Georgia. "You don't get weather that moves in this fast without some kind of artificial help." "Artificial help?" Clyde replied, his voice tight with frustration. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Cloud seeding, weather modification. The government's been doing it for decades. They can create storms, direct them, make them stronger or weaker." Earl couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Danny, you're talking about conspiracy theories. The Weather Service predicted this storm 3 days ago." Danny turned to face Earl, and even in the dim light of the flashlights, Earl could see that the man's eyes had the wild look of someone who'd lost touch with reality. "Oh, look who shows up," Danny said. "The guy who's been talking to our local contact." "What local contact?" "Don't play dumb. That woman, Norma, whatever her name is. How much is she paying you to keep us here?" Earl stared at Danny in disbelief. "She's not paying me anything. She offered hot coffee to stranded truckers. That's called being neighborly." "That's called reconnaissance," Danny shot back. "She's gathering intelligence on our loads, our schedules, our vulnerabilities, and you're helping her do it." Clyde stepped between Earl and Danny. "Look, we're all tired, we're all cold, and we're all losing money sitting here. But turning on each other isn't going to solve anything." "Isn't it?" Danny's voice was getting louder. "Maybe some of us aren't losing money. Maybe some of us are getting paid to make sure the rest of us stay right where we are." Earl could see that Danny's paranoid theories were starting to infect other drivers. Several men who'd been listening to the argument were nodding along, their faces showing the same combination of fear and anger that Earl had seen in Danny. "What would be the point of keeping us here?" Earl asked, trying to inject some logic into the conversation. "Cargo theft," Danny said immediately. "Hijacking, industrial espionage. Take your pick. There's millions of dollars worth of freight sitting on this highway, and we're all sitting ducks." "So your theory is that someone created a blizzard to trap a random group of trucks?" Clyde's voice was heavy with skepticism. "My theory is that this isn't random. Look around you. Look at what we're carrying. Electronics, medical equipment, construction materials, pharmaceuticals. This isn't a random collection of cargo. This is a targeted selection." Earl had to admit that Danny had a point about the cargo. Most of the trucks in the convoy were carrying high-value loads, but that didn't mean there was a conspiracy. It just meant that valuable cargo moved through this route regularly. "Even if that were true," Earl said, "what would be the end game? How would someone steal 30 truckloads of cargo from the middle of a highway?" "Easy," Danny replied. "They wait for us to abandon our trucks. When the weather gets bad enough, when we get cold enough, hungry enough, desperate enough, we'll take any offer of shelter. And once we're away from our trucks..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Earl could see the scenario Danny was painting: stranded drivers abandoning their vehicles to seek shelter, only to return and find their cargo gone. "That's why that woman came around earlier," Danny continued. "She's not offering help out of the goodness of her heart. She's offering bait. Get us away from our trucks, and her associates can move in and clean us out." Earl looked around at the faces of the other drivers. About half of them appeared to be buying into Danny's theory. The other half looked skeptical, but uncertain. And that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing of all. "What are you suggesting we do?" asked one of the drivers who'd been listening. "We organize," Danny said. "We set up watches. We make sure nobody leaves their truck unattended. And we keep a close eye on anyone who might be working with the locals." His gaze fixed on Earl as he said this last part. "I'm not working with anyone," Earl said firmly. "I'm just trying to wait out the storm like everyone else." "That's what someone working with them would say," Danny replied. Earl realized that he was being set up as a scapegoat. In Danny's paranoid worldview, every piece of evidence could be interpreted as proof of conspiracy. Denying involvement just proved that Earl was part of the cover-up. "This is insane," Clyde said. "We're talking about an elderly woman who offered coffee to stranded drivers. How does that turn into a criminal conspiracy?" "Because that's how these operations work," Danny explained with the patience of someone talking to a child. "They use locals to gain our trust, gather intelligence, get us to lower our guard. Then, when we're vulnerable, they move in for the kill." "The kill?" Earl couldn't believe Danny was talking about murder. "You think cargo thieves care about leaving witnesses? You think they're going to let 30 truck drivers walk away after seeing their faces?" Earl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Danny wasn't just talking about paranoid theories anymore. He was talking about genuine fear for their lives. "Look," Earl said, trying to be the voice of reason. "Even if there was some kind of conspiracy, what would be the point of discussing it out here in the open? If someone's watching us, if someone's listening to our conversations, then talking about it just tips them off. Unless," Danny said slowly, "you're trying to find out how much we know. Unless you're trying to gauge our level of preparedness." Earl realized that Danny's paranoia had reached the point where any argument against the conspiracy theory became evidence of the conspiracy itself. There was no logic that could penetrate that kind of thinking. "I'm going back to my truck," Earl said. "This conversation isn't accomplishing anything." "Running away," Danny called after him. "Going to report back to your handlers?" Earl ignored the taunt and trudged back through the snow to his Peterbilt. But as he settled into his cab, he could hear the argument continuing behind him, and it was getting louder and more heated. Over the next hour, Earl watched through his mirrors as the convoy divided into two distinct camps. Danny had gathered about 15 drivers around his truck, and they were clearly organizing some kind of defensive arrangement. The rest of the drivers had clustered around Clyde, and they seemed to be having a more rational discussion about their situation. But the division was becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. The two groups were eyeing each other with suspicion and hostility. and Earl found himself caught in the middle, trusted by neither side. Around 5 in the morning, Earl heard footsteps approaching his truck. He looked out to see Clyde trudging through the snow, looking exhausted and worried. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" Clyde asked. Earl unlocked his door and Clyde climbed into the passenger seat, bringing a gust of cold air and snow with him. "Things are getting ugly out there," Clyde said without preamble. "I noticed. What's Danny's group up to?" "They're setting up some kind of perimeter around their trucks. Posted guards, organized patrol schedules, acting like they're expecting an attack." Earl shook his head. "This is insane. We're stranded truckers, not soldiers." "I know that, and you know that. But Danny's got them convinced that we're sitting on a gold mine that someone's trying to steal. And once people believe that, they start seeing threats everywhere." Clyde was quiet for a moment, staring out at the snow. When he spoke again, his voice was troubled. "Earl, I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that this situation is going to get violent." "Violent how?" "Danny's group is armed. I saw at least 3 drivers with handguns, and one guy had what looked like a shotgun in his cab. They're talking about defending their property and protecting themselves from thieves." Earl felt his stomach drop. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. And here's the thing that really worries me. They're not just paranoid about outside threats anymore. They're starting to suspect other drivers. Anyone who doesn't join their group, anyone who questions their theories, anyone who talks to outsiders. Like me. Like you. Danny's convinced that you're working with that woman, Norma. And some of the other drivers are starting to believe him." Earl stared out at the storm, trying to process what Clyde was telling him. What had started as a routine weather delay was turning into something dangerous and unpredictable. "What about your group?" Earl asked. "We're trying to stay rational, but it's getting harder. When you've got 15 armed men convinced that everyone else is the enemy, it makes you start thinking about self-defense. It makes you start questioning who you can trust." Clyde turned to look at Earl directly. "I want you to know that I don't believe Danny's theories. I think you're just a driver who got caught in bad weather, same as the rest of us. But Earl..." "What?" "Some of the guys in my group aren't so sure. They're starting to ask questions about why you were talking to that woman, why you seem so calm about being stranded, why you keep trying to talk people out of taking precautions." Earl felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. "So, you're saying both groups suspect me?" "I'm saying that paranoia is contagious. And once it starts spreading, it doesn't matter what the truth is. It only matters what people believe." Through his windshield, Earl could see movement in both camps. Danny's group was organizing some kind of patrol, with drivers taking turns walking the perimeter of their defensive position. Clyde's group was having animated discussions, with lots of gesturing and pointing. "What do you think I should do?" Earl asked. "I think you should be very careful. Stay in your truck as much as possible. Don't approach either group unless they approach you first. And Earl?" "Yeah?" "If shooting starts, get the hell out of here. Don't worry about your load. Don't worry about anything except getting yourself to safety." As Clyde climbed down from Earl's cab and trudged back toward his own group, Earl realized that he was trapped in something much worse than a blizzard. He was trapped with a group of people who were losing their grip on reality, who were armed and dangerous, and who were looking for someone to blame for their situation. And increasingly, that someone was him. Earl started his engine to warm up the cab and tried to figure out his options. He could try to leave the convoy and make his way to safety, but in these weather conditions, abandoning the group might be suicide. He could try to join one of the factions, but both sides already suspected him of being a traitor. Or he could stay where he was and hope that sanity would eventually prevail. But as Earl watched the 2 groups of drivers fortifying their positions and organizing their defenses, he had a sinking feeling that sanity was in very short supply, and that before this storm was over, people were going to die. The only question was whether he would be one of them. Dawn came gray and cold, with no let-up in the storm. Earl had managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, and he felt like hell. His back ached from sleeping in the driver's seat. His head was pounding from stress and dehydration, and his fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank. If the weather didn't break soon, he'd have to shut down his engine to conserve what diesel he had left. But fuel was the least of his problems. At around 7 a.m., Earl heard shouting again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the argumentative voices of the night before. This was fear, panic, people calling for help. Earl climbed out of his truck and immediately saw what was causing the commotion. About 200 yards up the highway, barely visible through the driving snow, was an overturned truck. It looked like someone had tried to leave the convoy during the night and had lost control on the icy road. Several drivers were already trudging through the snow toward the accident, carrying flashlights and what looked like emergency equipment. Earl grabbed his first aid kit and flashlight and joined them. The overturned truck belonged to one of the drivers from Danny's group, a young man from Texas who'd been hauling computer equipment. The cab was crushed on the driver's side, and there was diesel fuel leaking from the ruptured tank, creating a dark stain in the snow. "Is he alive?" someone called out. Clyde was on his hands and knees next to the wreckage, trying to see into the cab. "Can't tell. Can't get to him with all this twisted metal." Danny arrived with several of his followers, and Earl could see immediately that the accident had done nothing to dampen his paranoid theories. "This is what happens when people try to run," Danny announced to the crowd. "This is what they want. They want us scattered, confused, picking each other off one by one." "Who's they?" Clyde demanded. "The truck went off the road because visibility is zero and the pavement is solid ice. It's an accident, not an attack." "Is it? How do we know someone didn't sabotage his truck? How do we know someone didn't force him off the road?" Earl couldn't believe what he was hearing. A man was trapped in an overturned truck, possibly dying, and Danny was using it to promote his conspiracy theories. "We need to get him out of there," Earl said, kneeling next to Clyde to examine the wreckage. "Can we lift the cab enough to get him clear?" "Maybe," Clyde replied. "But we'd need at least 6 men, and even then it would be dangerous. If the truck shifts the wrong way, then we better be careful," Earl said. He turned to address the crowd. "I need volunteers. Strong backs and steady hands." About 8 drivers stepped forward, including 2 from Danny's group. But as they positioned themselves around the overturned truck, Danny grabbed one of his followers by the arm. "Don't help them," Danny said quietly, but loud enough for Earl to hear. "This could be a setup." Earl stared at Danny in disbelief. "A setup for what? The man's trapped." "Could be, or could be this is exactly what they want. Get us all in one place, distracted, focused on something else while they move in on our trucks." "You're insane," Earl said flatly. "Am I? Look around. How many of us are here? How many trucks are sitting unguarded back there?" Earl followed Danny's gesture and realized that nearly half the convoy had come to help with the rescue. Their trucks were indeed sitting unattended, and in the whiteout conditions, someone could potentially approach them unseen. But Earl couldn't believe that anyone would be callous enough to use a man's suffering as a diversion for theft. "We're wasting time," Earl said. "Every minute we spend arguing is a minute this guy might be bleeding to death." Earl turned back to the volunteers who'd remained. "On 3, we lift together, slow and steady." The rescue attempt took nearly an hour. The truck was heavier than it looked, and the icy conditions made it difficult to get solid footing. But eventually they managed to lift the cab enough for Clyde to crawl inside and extract the driver. The young man was unconscious but alive, with what appeared to be a serious head injury and possibly internal bleeding. They carried him back to the convoy and put him in the warmest truck they could find, but it was clear he needed medical attention that none of them could provide. "We need to get him to a hospital," Earl said. "How?" Clyde asked. "Roads are closed, phones don't work, and visibility is maybe 50 feet. Someone has to try. He's not going to make it if we just sit here. That's when Danny spoke up. Nobody's leaving this convoy. Not for any reason. Earl turned to stare at him. The man could die. The man took his chances when he tried to run. We're not risking more lives on a rescue mission that might be exactly what our enemies want. Our enemies? Earl's voice was rising with anger and disbelief. We don't have enemies. We're truck drivers caught in a snowstorm. That's what you want us to believe, Danny replied. But some of us are starting to see the pattern. First, we get trapped by a convenient storm. Then someone comes around offering help, gathering intelligence. Then one of our people mysteriously tries to leave in the middle of the night and has a convenient accident. And now you want us to send more people away from the group. Earl could see that Danny's paranoid logic was starting to make sense to some of the other drivers. Fear and cold and frustration were making people susceptible to theories that would have seemed absurd under normal circumstances. What are you suggesting? Earl asked. I'm suggesting that everything that's happened since we got stuck here has been orchestrated, including this accident. You think someone forced that truck off the road? I think someone convinced the driver to leave. I think someone told him it was safe to go, that the roads were clearing, that help was waiting down the highway. And I think that someone is still among us. Danny's gaze fixed on Earl as he said this. You think I convinced him to leave? I think you've been working against this group from the beginning. I think you're part of whatever's happening here. Earl felt the crowd's attention focus on him, and he didn't like what he saw in their faces. Fear was turning to suspicion, and suspicion was turning to hostility. That's ridiculous, Earl said. I've been sitting in my truck all night, same as everyone else. Have you? Can anyone verify that? Can anyone prove you didn't sneak out, talk to that driver, convince him to make a run for it? Earl looked around at the faces surrounding him. These were men he'd been chatting with on the CB radio just 24 hours ago. Professional drivers with years of experience and usually solid judgment. But now they were looking at him like he was a dangerous criminal. This is insane, Earl said. You're all losing your minds. Are we? Danny stepped closer to Earl, and several of his followers moved with him. Or are we finally starting to see what's really going on here? Clyde positioned himself between Earl and Danny's group. Back off. Earl's not your enemy. How do you know? Danny demanded. How does anyone know? We're all strangers here. We don't know each other. We don't know each other's backgrounds. We don't know who might be working for the people trying to rob us. Because there are no people trying to rob us. Clyde's voice was loud with frustration. There's no conspiracy. There's no organized theft operation. There's just a bunch of truck drivers caught in bad weather. Then explain the timing, Danny shot back. Explain how a storm this severe developed this fast. Explain how 30 trucks carrying valuable cargo all got caught in the same place. Explain how that woman knew exactly where to find us. Earl realized that Danny had constructed a conspiracy theory that explained every aspect of their situation. In Danny's mind, nothing was accidental, nothing was coincidental, and everyone who disagreed with him was part of the plot. I don't have to explain anything, Earl said. Weather happens, storms develop, people get caught in bad situations. That's life. That's what they want you to think, Danny replied. That's how these operations work. Make everything look natural, make everything look accidental. But when you start adding up the pieces... Danny pulled out a small notebook and started reading from it. 37 trucks carrying approximately $12 million worth of cargo, trapped in an isolated location with no communication, no backup, no way to call for help, approached by a local resident offering assistance. One driver attempts to leave and has a fatal accident. And now someone's pushing for more people to leave the group. Earl had to admit that when Danny laid it out like that, it did sound suspicious. But Earl knew that correlation wasn't causation, that patterns could emerge from random events, that paranoid minds could find conspiracies in coincidence. "What do you want to do about it?" Earl asked. "I want to find out who's working with them," Danny said. "I want to find out who's been feeding them information, who's been helping them plan this operation." "And how do you propose to do that?" Danny smiled, and there was something cold and dangerous in his expression. "The same way people have been finding out the truth for thousands of years. We ask questions. We apply pressure. We keep asking until someone breaks." Earl felt ice forming in his stomach. Danny was talking about interrogation, possibly torture. The paranoid conspiracy theorist was preparing to turn his fellow drivers into suspects and prisoners. "You're talking about turning this convoy into a lynch mob," Earl said. "I'm talking about protecting ourselves and our livelihoods from criminals who are trying to rob us." "There are no criminals!" Earl's voice was getting loud with frustration and fear. "There's no robbery. There's no conspiracy. There's just a bunch of scared, cold, tired drivers who are starting to lose their minds." "That's exactly what someone who was part of the conspiracy would say," Danny replied. Earl realized that he was trapped in an impossible situation. Anything he said to defend himself would be interpreted as evidence of his guilt. Any attempt to bring logic or reason to the discussion would be seen as an attempt to cover up the truth. And the worst part was that some of the other drivers were starting to believe Danny's theories. Earl could see it in their faces. The growing certainty that they were victims of an elaborate criminal plot, and that Earl was somehow involved in it. "I think we need to search his truck," one of Danny's followers suggested. "See if he's got anything that doesn't belong there." "Good idea," Danny agreed. "And while we're at it, we should probably search everyone's truck. Make sure nobody's hiding anything." Earl knew that allowing Danny's group to search his truck would be a mistake. Even if they found nothing suspicious, they would interpret his compliance as evidence of guilt. But refusing to allow the search would be seen as proof that he had something to hide. "You're not searching my truck," Earl said firmly. "Why not?" Danny asked. "What are you afraid we'll find?" "I'm not afraid of anything, but I'm not letting a mob of paranoid drivers tear apart my property based on conspiracy theories." "Conspiracy theories?" Danny's voice was getting louder. $12 million in cargo, and you think this is just a theory? The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and Earl could see that violence was becoming increasingly likely. Danny's followers were positioning themselves around Earl, cutting off escape routes. Clyde and his supporters were moving to back Earl up, but they were outnumbered. And in the middle of it all, a seriously injured driver was lying unconscious in someone's truck, slowly dying while the people who should have been helping him argued about imaginary conspiracies. Earl made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He pushed through Danny's followers and started walking back toward his truck. "Where are you going?" Danny called after him. "To get my CB radio," Earl replied without turning around. "If you won't let anyone leave to get help for that injured driver, then I'm going to try to raise someone on the emergency channel." "Nobody touches any radios," Danny ordered. "No communication with the outside until we figure out who's working with them." Earl stopped walking and turned back to face the group. "So, now you're going to prevent us from calling for help for a dying man?" "I'm going to prevent anyone from revealing our position or our situation to hostile forces." Earl stared at Danny in disbelief. The man had lost all touch with reality. In his paranoid worldview, everything was a threat, everyone was an enemy, and any attempt to seek help was evidence of treachery. "You're insane," Earl said flatly. "Maybe," Danny replied. "But insane people sometimes see things that sane people miss. And what I see is a group of drivers who are about to lose everything they own to a bunch of professional thieves." Danny turned to address the entire crowd. "From now on, nobody leaves the convoy for any reason. Nobody uses any radios or communication equipment. Nobody talks to any outsiders. And anyone who tries to do any of those things will be considered a hostile agent." Earl realized that the situation had moved beyond paranoia into something approaching martial law. Danny had appointed himself the leader of a group of armed, frightened, desperate men who were prepared to use violence to protect themselves from imaginary threats. And Earl was at the top of their list of suspected enemies. As the crowd began to disperse, with Danny's followers returning to their defensive positions and Clyde's group retreating to their own area, Earl found himself walking back to his truck alone. He was no longer part of either faction. He was a suspected traitor in a convoy that was rapidly turning into an armed camp. And somewhere in the storm, an injured driver was dying while the people who could save him argued about conspiracies and searched for enemies that existed only in their own minds. Earl climbed into his truck and locked the doors, knowing that the thin metal and glass wouldn't protect him if the other drivers decided he was a threat that needed to be eliminated. But it was all the protection he had. Outside his windshield, the snow continued to fall with relentless intensity, and Earl couldn't shake the feeling that before the storm ended, blood was going to be spilled on the mountain highway. Earl spent the next few hours watching the convoy tear itself apart. Through his mirrors and windows, he could see Danny's group organizing patrols and setting up what appeared to be checkpoints around their trucks. Clyde's faction had pulled their vehicles into a defensive circle, and both groups were eyeing each other with increasing hostility. The injured driver from the overturned truck was still unconscious, and his condition was deteriorating. Earl had tried twice to approach the truck where they'd placed him, but both times he'd been turned away by armed guards who insisted he might be trying to finish the job. The paranoia had reached levels that would have been comical if they weren't so dangerous. Earl had watched grown men, professional drivers with decades of experience, arguing about whether the snow falling on their windshields was natural or part of some elaborate weather modification conspiracy. Around noon, the situation took a turn for the worse. Earl was trying to conserve fuel by running his engine only intermittently when he heard gunshots. 3 sharp cracks that echoed off the mountain walls, followed by shouting and the sound of truck engines roaring to life. Earl fired up his Peterbilt and climbed into the driver's seat to get a better view of what was happening. Through the driving snow, he could see figures running between trucks, flashlights swinging wildly, people taking cover behind vehicles. His CB radio crackled to life with panicked voices. "Shots fired! Shots fired! Someone's shooting at us!" "Where? Where are they coming from?" "I don't know. Could be anywhere in this storm." "Return fire! Defend the perimeter!" Earl grabbed his microphone. "This is Mountain Earl. Nobody should be shooting at anything. We need to figure out what's going on." "Earl, this is Danny. Stay off the radio. No communication until we secure the area." "Secure the area from what? There's nobody out there but us." "That's what you want us to think." Earl threw down the microphone in frustration. The shooting had pushed Danny's paranoia to new heights, and now he was treating the convoy like a military unit under attack. But Earl couldn't figure out who had been shooting or why. The only people within miles were the stranded drivers themselves, and as far as Earl knew, none of them had any reason to start a gunfight. Earl's question was answered a few minutes later when Clyde appeared at his window looking shaken and angry. "Someone shot at my truck," Clyde said as Earl opened his door. 3 rounds came right through my windshield. If I'd been sitting in the driver's seat, I'd be dead. "Who was shooting?" "Had to be someone from Danny's group. Nobody else is armed, and the shots came from their direction." Earl felt sick. "Why would they shoot at you?" "Because Danny's convinced I'm working with you, and you're working with the cargo thieves. In his mind, we're enemy agents who need to be eliminated." Earl stared at Clyde, trying to process what he was hearing. "He's trying to kill anyone who disagrees with him?" "Looks that way. And Earl, I've got some bad news. Danny's not just targeting me anymore. He's convinced his entire group that you're the ringleader of this whole operation." "Operation?" "The cargo theft conspiracy. In Danny's mind, you're not just working with the thieves. You're their leader, the person who organized this whole thing." Earl felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. "That's insane. I'm just a truck driver."
I know that, but Danny's got 15 armed men who believe otherwise, and they're talking about taking action. What kind of action? Clyde's expression was grim. The kind that involves rope and tree branches. Earl felt ice water in his veins. They're talking about lynching me? They're talking about eliminating the threat to the convoy. In their minds, you're responsible for everything that's gone wrong. The storm, the delay, the accident, everything. Earl looked out at the storm, trying to figure out his options. He could try to run, but in these weather conditions, leaving the convoy would probably be suicide. He could try to defend himself, but he was one man against 15. He could try to reason with Danny's group, but they were clearly beyond the reach of logic. "What about your people?" Earl asked. "Will they back me up?" "Some of them. But Earl, I've got to be honest with you. Some of my guys are starting to wonder if Danny might be right. Not about the conspiracy stuff, but about you being different somehow." "Different how?" "Calm. Too calm for someone in this situation. Most drivers would be panicking by now, looking for ways to get their cargo to its destination, worried about their livelihoods. But you've been taking this whole thing in stride, like you knew it was going to happen." Earl stared at Clyde. "So now you suspect me too?" "I don't, but I can see how others might. You've been the voice of reason throughout this whole mess, and sometimes that makes people suspicious." Earl realized that his attempts to keep the peace had actually made him look guilty in the eyes of frightened, paranoid drivers. By staying calm and rational, he'd marked himself as someone who wasn't genuinely affected by their situation. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should get the hell out of here. Take your truck and try to make it back down the mountain. Maybe you'll get lucky and find a plow crew or a state patrol unit." "And abandon that injured driver?" "Earl, that man's probably going to die whether you stay or go. But if you stay, you're definitely going to die. Danny's group is planning something for tonight, and I don't think you want to be here when it happens." Before Earl could respond, his CB radio crackled to life again. "Attention all drivers. This is Danny Morrison. We've identified the leader of the criminal organization that's been targeting our convoy. Earl Jacobson is working with cargo thieves to steal our loads and eliminate witnesses. He will be taken into custody at 1800 hours for questioning." Earl felt his blood run cold. Danny was announcing his intention to arrest Earl like this was some kind of military operation. "We have evidence that Jacobson has been in communication with hostile forces outside the convoy. We have evidence that he encouraged the driver who died in the accident to leave his truck. And we have evidence that he's been gathering intelligence on our cargo and our defensive preparations." Earl grabbed his microphone. "This is Earl Jacobson. None of that is true. There is no criminal organization. There are no cargo thieves. There's just a group of drivers caught in bad weather." "Save it for the interrogation," Danny replied. "You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself once we have you secured." Earl looked at Clyde. "Secured?" "They've been setting up some kind of containment area. Looks like they're planning to tie you up and ask you questions." Earl didn't need Clyde to spell out what asking questions might involve. In Danny's paranoid worldview, torture would be a legitimate method of extracting information from enemy agents. "I'm getting out of here," Earl said. "Good. But Earl, be careful. They've got people watching the perimeter. If they see you trying to leave..." Earl nodded. He understood. If Danny's group caught him trying to escape, they'd see it as proof of his guilt, and they might decide to skip the interrogation and move straight to execution. Earl waited until darkness fell before making his move. The storm was still raging, which would provide cover but also make driving extremely dangerous. He fired up his engine and tried to plan a route that would take him away from the convoy without attracting attention. But as Earl prepared to put his truck in gear, he saw something that made him pause. Through the snow, he could make out a figure walking between the trucks. It was Norma, the elderly woman who'd offered help to the stranded drivers. Earl watched in horror as the woman approached Danny's defensive perimeter, apparently unaware of how dangerous the situation had become. He could see flashlight beams focusing on her, could hear shouting voices carried by the wind. Earl grabbed his CB microphone. "Danny, that's just an old woman. She's not part of any conspiracy." "That's what you want us to think," Danny replied. "But we'll find out the truth soon enough." Earl realized that Danny's group was planning to interrogate Norma as well. An elderly woman who'd done nothing but offer hot coffee to stranded drivers was about to be subjected to questioning by armed, paranoid men who believed she was part of a criminal conspiracy. Earl made a decision that probably saved Norma's life and definitely sealed his own fate. He turned on his high beams and laid on his air horn, creating a distraction that drew attention away from the woman and toward his truck. The effect was immediate. Shouts of, "He's trying to escape," and "Stop him!" echoed through the convoy. Flashlight beams swung toward Earl's truck, and he could see figures running through the snow toward his position. Earl put his truck in gear and started moving, but he knew he was too late. Danny's group had been ready for this, and they'd positioned themselves to cut off his escape route. Earl made it maybe 100 yards before they forced him to stop. Armed drivers surrounded his truck, their faces grim and determined in the glow of their flashlights. "Get out of the truck!" Danny called out. "Now!" Earl knew he had no choice. If he tried to keep driving, they'd probably shoot him. If he stayed in the cab, they'd eventually find a way to get him out by force. Earl climbed down from his truck and immediately found himself surrounded by 15 armed men who looked at him like he was the most dangerous person they'd ever encountered. "Earl Jacobson," Danny said formally. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft, accessory to murder, and treason against this convoy." Treason? Earl couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You've betrayed your fellow drivers. You've put all of our lives at risk for money. And now you're going to tell us everything. Who you're working for, how this operation was planned, and where our cargo was supposed to be delivered." Earl looked around at the faces surrounding him. These were men he'd been chatting with on the CB just 2 days ago. Professional drivers with families and mortgages and bills to pay. But now they looked at him with the kind of hatred usually reserved for child molesters and terrorists. "I'm not working for anyone," Earl said. "I'm just a driver who got caught in bad weather, same as all of you." "We'll see about that," Danny replied. "Take him to the interrogation area." As they marched Earl through the snow toward what appeared to be a makeshift prison constructed from truck trailers, Earl caught a glimpse of Norma in the distance. The elderly woman was walking away from the convoy, apparently having been frightened off by the commotion. At least she was safe. But Earl knew that his own safety was another matter entirely. He was about to be subjected to interrogation by men who were convinced he was a dangerous criminal. Men who were armed, desperate, and completely detached from reality. And the worst part was that Earl knew there was nothing he could say or do that would convince them of his innocence. In Danny's paranoid worldview, every denial would be seen as further evidence of guilt. Every attempt to reason with them would be interpreted as an attempt to manipulate them. As they pushed Earl into the improvised prison, he realized that he was probably going to die on this mountain highway. Not from the weather, not from an accident, but from the fear and paranoia of his fellow drivers. Men who had lost their grip on reality so completely that they were willing to torture and kill an innocent person, rather than admit that sometimes bad things just happen for no reason at all. The storm continued to rage outside, but Earl knew that the real danger came from the people who were supposed to be his allies. People who had let fear turn them into something worse than the imaginary enemies they thought they were fighting. And as Earl sat in the darkness of his makeshift prison, listening to the sound of his captors planning his interrogation, he wondered if anyone would ever know the truth about what happened to the convoy that got caught in the storm on Vail Pass. Or if they would all just disappear into the white silence of the mountains, another group of people who had let fear destroy them from within.
Chester Vance had been hauling freight through the Rocky Mountains for 14 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts about two things: weather and machinery. Both could kill you if you weren't paying attention. Both gave you warnings if you knew how to listen. And that morning, as Chester fired up his 2018 Freightliner at a truck stop in Cheyenne, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on. The engine started smooth as silk. Oil pressure was good, coolant temperature normal, but there was something in the way the truck felt when he pulled out of the parking space. A subtle difference in how the brakes engaged when he tested them rolling through the lot. Chester had owned this rig for 3 years. He knew every sound it made, every vibration, every quirk in its personality. And this morning, something was different. Probably nothing, he muttered to himself as he merged onto I-80 westbound. The load in his trailer was standard stuff, medical equipment bound for a hospital in Grand Junction. Not hazardous, not overweight, just a routine run that should take him through some of the most beautiful scenery in Colorado. The first hour was uneventful. Chester grabbed coffee at a truck stop near Laramie and checked his pre-trip inspection again. Everything looked normal. Tires good, brakes adjusted properly, no leaks, no loose bolts. Maybe he was just being paranoid. But as he started climbing toward the Colorado border, that nagging feeling in his gut got stronger. There was something about the way the truck was responding to input that felt off. When he pressed the brake pedal, there was a tiny delay before he felt the shoes grab. When he downshifted for a hill, the engine seemed to hesitate for just a fraction of a second. Small things, subtle things. The kind of things that might be dismissed as normal variation or driver fatigue. But Chester had been doing this too long to ignore his instincts. He pulled into a rest area near the Colorado state line and popped the hood. Everything looked normal. Fluid levels good, belts tight, no obvious signs of tampering or damage. He walked around the truck, checking the brake lines, the air hoses, the electrical connections, all standard. But when he crouched down to examine the front axle, something caught his eye. A small scratch on the brake adjustment mechanism, fresh metal showing through the paint. It could have been road debris, could have been normal wear from gravel and salt, but it was in a spot that shouldn't see that kind of damage. Chester felt his heart rate pick up. In 14 years of driving, he'd heard stories about brake tampering. Usually it was insurance fraud. Drivers or owners looking to stage accidents for the payout. Sometimes it was sabotage by competitors trying to put independent truckers out of business. And sometimes it was just malicious vandalism by people who hated truckers for reasons that made no sense to anyone with half a brain. But those were stories, urban legends, the kind of things that happened to other people in other places. Chester had never actually seen it happen. He pulled out his phone and took pictures of the scratch. Then he crawled under the truck as far as he could without proper equipment and looked for other signs of tampering. Nothing obvious, but that scratch bothered him. Chester climbed back into the cab and called Floyd's garage in Sterling, Colorado. Floyd Hutchins had been working on trucks for 30 years, and if anyone would know what to look for, it was him. "Floyd, it's Chester Vance. You got a minute?" "Chester, how's the road treating you?" "That's what I'm calling about. I think someone might have messed with my brakes." There was a pause. "That's a serious accusation, Chester. What makes you think that?" Chester described the subtle changes in brake feel, the scratch on the adjustment mechanism, his general sense that something was wrong with the truck. "Could be nothing," Floyd said. "Could be normal wear. But if you're worried about it, bring her in. I can do a complete brake inspection, check all the lines and components." "How long would that take?" "Couple hours if I drop everything else. But Chester, if you really think someone tampered with your brakes, you need to call the state patrol. That's attempted murder." Chester felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Let me get to you first. Make sure there's really a problem before I start making accusations." "Fair enough. I'll clear a bay for you." Chester ended the call and sat in the rest area for a few more minutes, trying to decide what to do. He was probably overreacting. The truck was running fine. The brakes seemed to be working normally, and that scratch could have a dozen innocent explanations. But as he prepared to pull back onto the highway, Chester noticed something else. A white pickup truck was parked at the far end of the rest area, and the driver appeared to be watching him through binoculars. When Chester looked directly at the truck, it quickly pulled away, heading east toward the Wyoming border. That could be innocent, too. Could be someone bird-watching, or checking out the scenery, or any number of harmless activities. But combined with everything else, it felt like another piece of a puzzle Chester didn't want to solve. He fired up the Freightliner and pulled back onto I-80, pushing the speed limit as much as he dared. Sterling was about 2 hours away, and Floyd's garage would be the best place to find out if his paranoia was justified or if he was losing his mind. The truck ran smooth for the first hour. Chester started to relax, started to convince himself that he'd been imagining problems that didn't exist. Maybe the scratch was just normal wear. Maybe the brake feel was just cold weather affecting the air pressure. Maybe he'd been driving so many years that he was starting to see threats where none existed. Then he crested a hill near the town of Big Spring and saw the grade ahead. It was a long, steep descent with several sharp curves. The kind of hill that separated the good drivers from the dead drivers. The kind of place where brake failure could turn a routine delivery into a multi-vehicle catastrophe. Chester downshifted and tapped the brake pedal gently to test his stopping power before starting the descent. The pedal went straight to the floor. No resistance. No grab. No stopping power at all. Chester's blood turned to ice water. He grabbed the air brake valve and yanked it, hoping the emergency system would engage. Nothing. The gauge showed no air pressure in the system at all. The truck was accelerating down the grade, picking up speed with every second. Chester downshifted frantically, trying to use engine compression to slow down, but with a 40,000-pound load pushing from behind, it wasn't nearly enough. He looked at his speedometer. 50 miles per hour and climbing. The first curve was coming up fast, and there was a line of cars ahead of him with nowhere to go. Chester grabbed his CB mic with one hand while steering with the other. "Mayday, Mayday. This is eastbound truck on I-80 near Big Spring. I've lost all brakes. Runaway truck, I repeat, runaway truck." The response was immediate. "Roger, eastbound truck. State Patrol is notified. Can you make the runaway truck ramp about 2 miles ahead?" Chester looked down the grade and saw the ramp. It was his only chance, a gravel incline designed specifically for situations like this. But it was on the right side of the highway, and he was in the left lane with cars blocking his path. "I'm going to try," Chester said into the mic. Then he did something he'd never done in 14 years of driving. He laid on his air horn and started forcing his way through traffic. Cars scattered like startled birds. Some pulled onto the shoulder, others accelerated to get out of his way. One sedan swerved so hard to avoid him that it spun out on the shoulder, but Chester couldn't stop to check if anyone was hurt. He was doing 60 now, the truck shaking like it was coming apart, the engine screaming in low gear. The runaway ramp was coming up fast. Chester cut across 3 lanes of traffic, praying that his tires would hold and that no one would try to occupy the same space he needed. Cars were honking, people were gesturing, but everyone seemed to understand that this wasn't road rage or reckless driving. This was survival. Chester hit the runaway ramp, doing 55 miles per hour. The gravel and sand grabbed his wheels immediately, and the sudden deceleration threw him forward against his seatbelt hard enough to knock the wind out of him. The truck lurched and bucked as it plowed through the deep gravel, but it was slowing down. After what seemed like an eternity, the Freightliner finally came to a stop about 3/4 of the way up the ramp. Chester sat there for a moment, hands shaking, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. His brakes had failed, completely and catastrophically, on one of the most dangerous grades in Colorado. If that runaway ramp hadn't been there, if he hadn't been able to get across 3 lanes of traffic, if any number of things had gone differently,
he would be dead right now, along with whoever had the misfortune to be in his path. Chester grabbed his phone and called Floyd. "Floyd, it's Chester. I need you to get out here right now. My brakes just failed completely on the Big Spring grade." "Jesus Christ, Chester, are you okay?" "I'm alive. Truck's stuck on the runaway ramp, but I'm alive. And Floyd? You were right. This wasn't an accident. Someone tried to kill me."
Chester ended the call and leaned back in his seat, adrenaline still flooding his system. Through his side mirror, he could see state patrol cars approaching with their lights flashing. Soon there would be questions, investigations, paperwork. But right now, all Chester could think about was that scratch on his brake adjustment mechanism. Someone had done this to him. Someone had deliberately sabotaged his truck, knowing that he would be driving through some of the most dangerous terrain in the country. Someone had tried to murder him and anyone unlucky enough to be on the road when his brakes failed. But who? And why? Chester was about to find out that those were very dangerous questions to ask. The state patrol arrived first, followed by an ambulance and a fire truck. Chester climbed down from his cab on shaky legs and was immediately surrounded by emergency personnel checking him for injuries. He was bruised from the seatbelt and shaken from the experience, but physically unharmed. Officer Martinez, a young state trooper with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, took charge of the scene. "Mr. Vance, I need to know exactly what happened here." Chester described the brake failure, the loss of air pressure, the terrifying descent down the grade. As he spoke, he could see other officers examining his truck, taking photographs, making notes. "Had you noticed any problems with the brakes before today?" Officer Martinez asked. "Just some subtle changes in feel. That's why I was heading to Floyd's garage in Sterling. I wanted to have them checked out." "Any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt you?" Chester shook his head. "I can't think of anyone. I'm just an independent owner-operator trying to make a living." Floyd arrived about 45 minutes later with his heavy-duty tow truck. Chester watched as the mechanic crawled under his Freightliner, examining the brake system with a flashlight and a practiced eye. After about 10 minutes, Floyd emerged, his face grim. "Chester, you need to see this." Floyd led him and Officer Martinez to the front of the truck and pointed to the brake lines. "Someone cut these, not completely. That would have been too obvious. They made small incisions, just deep enough to weaken the lines so they'd fail under pressure." Chester felt sick. How long would something like that take to fail? "Depends on how much braking you did, how hot the lines got, how much pressure you put on the system. Could be hours, could be days. But on a grade like the one you just came down?" Floyd shook his head. "That was exactly what they were counting on." Officer Martinez was already on her radio, calling for additional units and a forensics team. "Mr. Vance, this is now a criminal investigation. Someone tried to kill you. We need to figure out who had access to your truck and when this sabotage could have occurred." Chester thought back over the past 24 hours. "I parked at the Pilot truck stop in Cheyenne last night around 8. Slept in the sleeper, got up around 5, left around 6. Anyone approach you? Any unusual incidents?" Chester was about to say no when he remembered something. "There was another driver there. Guy named Virgil something. He was having brake problems too. Asked if I knew a good mechanic in the area." Floyd looked up from where he was examining the damaged brake lines. "What did this Virgil look like?" "Big guy, maybe 6'4", probably 300 pounds. Bald head, bushy gray beard. Drove an older Peterbilt, dark blue. Had some kind of accent, maybe Southern." Officer Martinez was writing quickly. "Did you two have any kind of disagreement?" "Not exactly, but..." Chester tried to remember the conversation. "He seemed to know a lot about my business. Asked what I was hauling, where I was going, what route I was taking. I thought he was just making conversation, but now it sounds like he was gathering intelligence," Floyd finished. "But why?" Chester asked. I don't even know the guy. Why would he want to hurt me? Officer Martinez closed her notebook. That's what we're going to find out. I'm going to need you to come to the station and give a formal statement. And I'm calling in a forensics team to go over your truck completely. What about my load? I've got medical equipment that needs to be in Grand Junction tomorrow. The load is evidence now, the trooper said. Nothing moves until we've processed everything. Chester felt a wave of frustration wash over him. Not only had someone tried to kill him, but now his livelihood was on hold indefinitely. The hospital would cancel the contract. His dispatcher would find other drivers for future loads. Word would get around that Chester Vance was the kind of driver who couldn't make his deliveries on time. How long? Chester asked. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on what we find. As Chester stood there watching the forensics team process his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Someone had tried to kill him once. They would probably try again. And the only person who might have answers was a man who could very well be the one trying to kill him in the first place. Chester's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Heard about your brake failure on the CB. Hell of a thing. We need to talk. Virgil. Chester showed the message to Officer Martinez. Her expression hardened. Don't respond to that, she said. And don't meet with him under any circumstances. If he's our saboteur, he might be trying to finish what he started. But as Chester looked at the message, he wondered if Virgil might actually be trying to help. Maybe the big man had information about who was really behind the sabotage. Maybe he was just as much a victim as Chester was. Or maybe he was a killer who enjoyed playing games with his prey. Chester was about to find out which one was true. Chester spent the rest of the day at the State Patrol office, going through security footage from the Cheyenne truck stop and providing detailed descriptions of everyone he could remember seeing near his truck. The investigation was thorough but frustrating. Too many people had access to the parking area, and the lighting was poor enough that identifying specific individuals would be difficult. Officer Martinez had run background checks on anyone named Virgil who owned a dark blue Peterbilt in the region, but so far hadn't found any matches. The text message had come from a burner phone with no traceable registration. Mr. Vance, I want you to understand that you're in real danger, Martinez said as they wrapped up the interview. Whoever did this has shown they're willing to commit murder. Until we catch them, you need to be extremely careful. What am I supposed to do? I can't work without my truck and I can't pay my bills without working. We'll have your truck released as soon as forensics is finished with it. But in the meantime, you might want to consider staying somewhere other than your usual haunts. If someone's targeting you specifically, they probably know your routines. Chester left the State Patrol office feeling more vulnerable than he had in his entire life. Someone wanted him dead, and he had no idea why. His truck was impounded, his cargo was evidence, and his livelihood was on hold indefinitely. He checked into a budget motel on the outskirts of Sterling and tried to figure out his next move. The insurance company would want to investigate before paying any claims. His dispatcher was already asking questions about when he'd be available for new loads. And somewhere out there, a person who had tried to kill him once was probably planning to try again. Chester's phone rang around 8 p.m. The caller ID showed a local number he didn't recognize. Chester Vance. Mr. Vance, this is Virgil Kowalski. I think we need to talk. Chester felt his pulse spike. Against his better judgment and Officer Martinez's explicit instructions, he found himself curious about what Virgil had to say. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Too easy for people to listen in. You know the Flying J truck stop on Highway 14? Meet me there in an hour. Come alone, and don't tell the State Patrol about this call. Why would I do that? For all I know, you're the one who sabotaged my brakes. If I wanted you dead, Mr. Vance, you'd already be dead. I had access to your truck all night in Cheyenne. Could have done a lot worse than weakening your brake lines. The logic was sound, but Chester still felt uneasy. What do you want to talk about?
about why someone's targeting independent drivers in this region, about why your brake failure wasn't random, and about why you and I might both be in more danger than you realize. The line went dead. Chester stared at his phone, weighing his options. He could call Officer Martinez and report the contact. He could ignore Virgil's request and hope the State Patrol investigation would eventually identify the real saboteur. Or he could take a calculated risk and see what Virgil had to say. Chester made his decision. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the Flying J. The truck stop was busy for a weeknight, with dozens of big rigs parked in the back lot and a steady stream of drivers coming and going from the restaurant and convenience store. Chester found Virgil's dark blue Peterbilt parked in a relatively isolated corner and approached cautiously. Virgil climbed down from his cab as Chester approached. In person, the man was even more imposing than he'd seemed in Cheyenne, well over 6 feet tall and built like a linebacker, but his expression was more worried than threatening. "Thanks for coming," Virgil said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm here. Now what's this about?" "Get in my cab. Easier to talk without half the truck stop listening in." Chester hesitated. Getting into Virgil's truck would put him at a serious disadvantage if the big man had hostile intentions. But he'd come this far, and backing down now wouldn't get him any answers. Chester climbed into the passenger seat of Virgil's truck. The cab was neat and organized, with personal photos taped to the dashboard and a small arsenal of CB radios and communication equipment. "Before we start," Virgil said, "I need you to understand something. I didn't sabotage your brakes. I wouldn't do that to a fellow driver, and I sure as hell wouldn't risk killing innocent people on the highway." "So why did you want to talk to me in Cheyenne? Why all the questions about my cargo en route?" "Because I was trying to figure out if you were a target. See, Mr. Vance, what happened to you today wasn't random. Someone's been systematically targeting independent drivers in this region for months." Virgil pulled out a folder filled with newspaper clippings and printed emails. "Look at this. 7 brake failures in the past 6 months, all involving independent owner-operators, all on dangerous mountain grades. 3 drivers died. 2 were seriously injured. Only you and one other guy managed to make it to runaway ramps." Chester studied the clippings. The pattern was clear and disturbing. All the incidents involved similar circumstances: brake failure on steep grades, trucks carrying valuable cargo, independent drivers with no corporate backing. "Why independent drivers?" Chester asked. "Because we're vulnerable. We don't have big companies with legal departments and investigators backing us up. When something happens to us, it gets written off as mechanical failure or driver error. Nobody digs too deep. But why target us at all?" Virgil's expression darkened. "Because someone's stealing our cargo. Think about it. Your truck fails on a dangerous grade. You either die or get seriously injured. The truck gets towed to an impound lot or salvage yard. During all the confusion, it would be easy for someone to swap out cargo or just make it disappear entirely." Chester felt sick. "You think this is about cargo theft?" "I think it's bigger than that. I think someone's using sabotage to create opportunities for theft, and they don't care how many drivers they kill in the process." Virgil showed Chester another set of documents. "I've been tracking the cargo that disappeared from those 7 brake failures. Medical equipment, electronics, pharmaceuticals, all high-value stuff that would be easy to resell on the black market. Total value? Close to $2 million. "Jesus! Have you taken this to the police?" "I tried. They said it was all circumstantial evidence. Could be coincidence. Could be mechanical failures. Could be driver error." Virgil's voice was bitter. "They're not going to believe there's a conspiracy until someone hands them a confession and a pile of bodies." Chester studied the documents more carefully. "What makes you think I was specifically targeted?" "Your cargo manifest. Medical equipment worth over $200,000. That's exactly the kind of high-value load these people go after." Virgil leaned forward. "And here's the thing that really bothers me. Your brake lines were cut professionally. Whoever did it knew exactly how to weaken them so they'd fail under stress, but not immediately. That takes knowledge and experience. So we're looking for someone with mechanical expertise. We're looking for someone with access to trucks, knowledge of brake systems, and connections to black market cargo buyers. Could be a mechanic, could be a tow truck operator, could be someone who works at truck stops or impound lots. Chester felt a chill. Floyd Hutchins examined my truck. He's the one who identified the sabotage. I know Floyd. Good man. Been working on trucks for 30 years. But think about it. Who would be in a better position to sabotage trucks than a mechanic who drivers trust? The thought was disturbing, but Chester couldn't dismiss it entirely. Floyd had certainly had opportunities to sabotage trucks over the years, and his expertise would make him capable of the kind of professional job that had been done on Chester's brake lines. I can't believe Floyd would do something like this. Maybe not, but we need to consider all possibilities. Virgil started his engine. There's something else I want to show you, another piece of the puzzle. They drove through Sterling to an industrial area on the outskirts of town. Virgil parked behind a row of warehouses and pointed to a building about a block away. That's Mountain States Recovery, Virgil said. They handle most of the truck towing and impound work in this area. 3 of the 7 brake failure incidents I've been tracking. The trucks were towed there. Chester could see several semi-trailers parked in the lot behind the building. So I did some checking. Mountain States Recovery is owned by a company called Front Range Logistics.
And Front Range Logistics has contracts with several salvage yards and parts dealers that have been flagged by insurance investigators for suspicious activity. What kind of suspicious activity? The kind where valuable cargo disappears and gets replaced with junk before insurance adjusters can inspect it. The kind where trucks get stripped for parts faster than paperwork can be processed. The kind where evidence of sabotage gets destroyed before investigators can examine it. Chester stared at the Mountain States Recovery Building. If Virgil was right, they were looking at part of a criminal organization that used truck sabotage as a cover for large-scale cargo theft. Have you shared this information with the State Patrol? I tried. They said I needed more evidence. Said they couldn't investigate based on suspicions and coincidences. Virgil's voice was frustrated. That's why I wanted to talk to you. You're fresh evidence. Your case might be the one that finally gets them to take this seriously. Chester pulled out his phone. I'm calling Officer Martinez. She needs to know about this. Wait. Virgil grabbed Chester's wrist. Before you do that, there's something else you need to know. Something that might change how you approach this. What? Virgil looked around nervously, as if checking to make sure they weren't being watched. I think law enforcement might be involved. The words hit Chester like a physical blow. That's impossible. Is it? Think about it. How do the saboteurs know which trucks to target? How do they get access to cargo manifests and route information? How do they time the sabotage so perfectly? Chester's mind was racing. You're talking about inside information. I'm talking about someone with access to shipping records, route plans, and cargo values. Someone who knows which trucks will be carrying what cargo and when they'll be most vulnerable. Virgil showed Chester another set of documents. I've been tracking the pattern. Every truck that's been sabotaged had recent state patrol inspections. Every cargo theft happened after the truck was impounded for investigation, and every case was handled by officers from the same district. Chester studied the documents. Officer Martinez's name appeared on several of them. You think Martinez is involved? I think someone in that department is feeding information to the thieves. Could be her, could be someone else. But the pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. Chester felt betrayed and confused. Officer Martinez had seemed genuinely concerned about his safety. But if Virgil was right, her investigation might be designed to cover up the crime rather than solve it. What do you want me to do? I want you to help me gather evidence. Real evidence that can't be dismissed or covered up. Evidence that will force someone to take action.
How? By playing along with their game. See, I think they're going to try to recruit you. Chester stared at him. What do you mean? Think about it. Your cargo is gone, your truck is impounded, you're facing potential lawsuits and insurance problems. Right about now, you're probably feeling pretty desperate and angry at the system. Chester had to admit that Virgil was right. He was facing financial ruin through no fault of his own. That's exactly when someone's going to approach you with an offer, Virgil continued. Money to look the other way when certain shipments get lost during investigations. Maybe provide some inside information about other drivers, other loads. Small stuff at first, nothing that seems too criminal. And you want me to go along with it? I want you to gather evidence. Names, procedures, who's really in charge. And when we have enough to blow this thing wide open, we take it to the FBI. Chester felt like he was being asked to walk through a minefield blindfolded. But if Virgil was right about the scope of the conspiracy, it might be the only way to stop it. This is crazy, Chester said. This is survival, Virgil replied. Because if we don't stop them, you're going to have another accident real soon, and next time, they might not leave anything to chance. As they drove back toward the truck stop, Chester couldn't shake the feeling that he was already in deeper than he wanted to be. But turning back now might mean letting killers continue to prey on drivers like himself, and it might mean that his next trip through the Rocky Mountains would be his last. Chester didn't have to wait long for Virgil's prediction to come true. The call came 2 days later while he was sitting in Floyd's waiting room, hoping to get his truck released from the State Patrol impound lot. Mr. Vance, this is Detective Harrison with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. I'd like to meet with you this morning to discuss your case. Chester felt his pulse spike. This wasn't Officer Martinez calling with an update. This was someone entirely new, from a different agency. I already gave a statement to the State Patrol. I know. That's part of what I want to discuss. There have been some developments in your case that might affect your situation. Could you meet me at Murphy's Diner on Main Street, say 10 a.m.? Chester agreed and hung up, immediately calling Virgil's number. The big man answered on the first ring. They made contact, Chester said quietly. Someone calling himself Detective Harrison from CBI wants to meet with me. That was fast. They must be feeling pressure from the State Patrol investigation. Virgil's voice was tense. Remember what we talked about. Listen to what they have to say, but don't commit to anything, and try to get names, details, anything we can use as evidence. Chester drove to Murphy's Diner feeling like he was walking into a trap. Detective Harrison was already there when he arrived. A well-dressed man in his 40s with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of getting people to do what he wanted. Mr. Vance, thank you for coming. Harrison gestured to the booth across from him. I'll get straight to the point. We have reason to believe that your brake failure wasn't random. Chester tried to keep his expression neutral. Officer Martinez already told me it was sabotage. Yes, but what Officer Martinez doesn't know is that your incident is part of a much larger pattern. We've been investigating a criminal organization that's been targeting independent truckers throughout the region. Harrison pulled out a tablet and showed Chester what appeared to be law enforcement intelligence reports. Someone with access to shipping manifests and route information has been selling that data to cargo thieves. Your truck was sabotaged to create an opportunity for theft. This was exactly what Virgil had predicted, but hearing it from someone claiming to be a federal investigator made it feel more real and more frightening. What does this have to do with me? We need your help to identify the people responsible. See, we believe the criminal organization is going to try to recruit you. Chester felt a chill. Recruit me for what? They need inside information. Shipping schedules, cargo manifests, route plans. They approach drivers who are in financial trouble and offer them money to provide that information. Small amounts at first, nothing that seems too criminal. Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Vance, your brake failure has put you in exactly the position these criminals look for.
You're facing financial problems, your reputation in the industry is damaged, and you probably feel angry at the system that's failed to protect you. And you want me to pretend to go along with it? I want you to actually go along with it. Take their money, provide carefully selected information that will give you and help us identify the key players in their organization. Harrison slid a business card across the table. In exchange, we can make your current problems disappear. New truck, clean record, and substantial compensation for your cooperation with our investigation. Chester stared at the card. What kind of compensation? $50,000 plus full replacement value for your current truck and trailer. We can also ensure that this incident doesn't affect your insurance rates or your ability to get financing for future equipment. It was a generous offer. More than generous. The kind of offer that could solve all of Chester's immediate financial problems and set him up for future success. And if I refuse? Harrison's expression didn't change, but his tone became slightly cooler. Then you're on your own. No protection from future attacks, no help with your insurance problems, and no way to prove your innocence if these criminals decide to frame you for insurance fraud. The threat was subtle but clear. Chester could cooperate and profit, or he could refuse and face the consequences alone. I need time to think about it. Of course, but don't take too long. Our intelligence suggests that the criminal organization will be making contact with you soon. If you take their deal instead of ours... Harrison shrugged. Well, let's just say that criminal organizations don't offer retirement plans. Chester left the diner feeling more confused than ever. Harrison's story matched what Virgil had told him about a cargo theft conspiracy, but it also conflicted with Virgil's warning about law enforcement involvement. Was Harrison legitimate? Was he part of the conspiracy? Or was he something else entirely? Chester called Virgil and arranged to meet at a different truck stop, this one outside of Sterling. When he arrived, the big man was pacing next to his truck, clearly agitated. How did it go? Virgil asked. Chester described the meeting, Harrison's offer, and the subtle threats that came with it. $50,000, Virgil said thoughtfully. That's a lot of money for cooperation with a federal investigation. You think it's legitimate? I think it's exactly what I was afraid of. Virgil pulled out his phone and showed Chester a search result. There's no Detective Harrison with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. I checked their website, called their main number. They've never heard of him. Chester felt his stomach drop. So he's fake. He's something, but he's not CBI. Either he's part of the cargo theft ring or he's working for someone who wants to control the investigation before it gets too close to the truth. What do I do? You play along. Take the meeting with whoever contacts you next, but remember that nothing they tell you can be trusted, and whatever you do, don't let them know you're suspicious. Chester was about to respond when his phone buzzed with a text message. The number was blocked, but the message was clear. Need to talk. Truck stop on Highway 34, midnight. Come alone. F. Chester showed the message to Virgil. F? You think that's Floyd? Virgil's expression darkened. Could be. Or it could be someone using Floyd's initial to get you to trust them. Only one way to find out. Chester, this is getting dangerous. If Floyd's involved in this conspiracy, meeting with him could be a death sentence. And if he's not involved, he might have information that could help us expose the real criminals. Chester made his decision. I'm going. Then I'm following you. If this goes bad, you'll need backup. That night, Chester drove to the truck stop on Highway 34, a small operation that catered mostly to local traffic. Floyd's pickup truck was already there, parked in the shadows away from the main building. Chester parked nearby and approached on foot. Floyd climbed out of his truck as Chester got closer, and even in the dim light, Chester could see that the mechanic looked haggard and scared. Chester, thank God you came. We need to talk. I'm listening. Floyd looked around nervously, as if checking for surveillance.
Someone's been asking questions about you, about our conversation, about what I found when I examined your truck. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest they don't want the sabotage investigation to go anywhere. The kind that come with threats if I don't play along. Chester felt ice forming in his stomach. Who's been asking? People who know where I live, where my grandkids go to school. People who made it very clear that my cooperation isn't optional. Floyd pulled out a manila envelope. They want me to change my assessment of your brake failure. Say it was mechanical failure, not sabotage. Make the evidence disappear. Are you going to do it? Hell no. But Chester, you need to understand what you're up against. This isn't just cargo theft. This is organized crime with connections to law enforcement, maybe even federal agencies. Floyd handed Chester the envelope. These are copies of all my documentation from your truck. Photos, measurements, analysis reports. Hide them somewhere safe. Because the originals are going to disappear, along with any other evidence that points to sabotage. Chester opened the envelope and saw detailed technical reports that clearly showed his brake lines had been deliberately cut. Floyd, you need to take this to the FBI. I tried, made some calls, sent some emails. Know what I found out? The FBI already has an ongoing investigation into cargo theft in this region. Investigation that's being run by someone who matches the description of the man who's been threatening me. Chester's blood ran cold. Detective Harrison. You met him too? Floyd's voice was barely a whisper. Chester, I think we're dealing with federal agents who've gone rogue. People with badges and jurisdiction who are using their authority to cover up their crimes. What do? We get out of their way and hope they don't decide we know too much. Floyd started walking back toward his truck. Chester, I'm going to change my report. I'm going to say your brake failure was mechanical, and you're going to accept whatever deal they offer you. I can't do that. Other drivers will die. Floyd stopped and turned back. Other drivers are already dying, and if we try to fight this, we'll be next. As Floyd drove away, Chester stood in the truck stop parking lot trying to process what he'd learned. The conspiracy was bigger than Virgil had suspected. It involved not just cargo thieves and corrupt local officials, but federal agents who were using their authority to protect their criminal enterprise. Chester's phone buzzed with another text message. We know about your meeting. Time to choose sides. Harrison. Chester realized that he was being watched, that every move he made was being monitored by people with resources and authority that far exceeded anything he could hope to match. He was trapped between criminals who wanted to recruit him and authorities who might be criminals themselves. And somewhere in the middle, Virgil was gathering evidence that might get them all killed. Chester made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He texted back, I'm interested in your offer. When do we meet? The response came immediately. Tomorrow. Details to follow. Welcome to the team. As Chester drove back towards Sterling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just signed his own death warrant. But if Virgil was right about the scope of the conspiracy, playing along might be the only way to gather enough evidence to expose it. The only question was whether they'd live long enough to use that evidence, and whether anyone would believe them even if they did. The meeting was set for the next evening at an abandoned truck stop on a back road outside Denver. Chester arrived early, parking his rental truck where he could see anyone approaching while maintaining an escape route. Virgil was positioned about a mile away, monitoring radio communications and ready to call for help if things went wrong. Harrison arrived precisely on time, driving a black SUV with government plates. But he wasn't alone. 2 other men climbed out of the vehicle, both wearing the kind of casual professional clothing that screamed federal agent. Mr. Vance, Harrison called out as he approached. Glad you decided to join us. These are my associates, Agents Parker and Webb. Chester studied the 3 men carefully. They looked legitimate, carried themselves with the confidence of law enforcement, and spoke with the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with criminals and suspects.
But Virgil's warnings echoed in Chester's mind. These could be rogue agents using their federal credentials to protect a criminal enterprise. Or they could be legitimate investigators trying to expose that enterprise. There was no way to tell the difference. "Before we get started," Harrison said, "I need to ask you some questions. Have you discussed this investigation with anyone? Any other law enforcement agencies? Any fellow drivers? Anyone at all?" Chester had prepared for this question. Just Floyd, the mechanic who examined my truck, and I had to tell him not to discuss it with anyone else. Good, because operational security is critical to this investigation. If word gets out that we're working together, it could compromise years of work and put both of us in danger. Harrison gestured toward the abandoned truck stop building. "Let's go inside where we can talk privately." Chester followed the three men into the building, noting that one of them stayed near the door while the others led him to a table in what had once been the restaurant area. "Here's how this works," Harrison began. "We've identified the criminal organization that's been targeting truckers in this region. They're sophisticated, well-funded, and have connections throughout the transportation industry." He pulled out a folder and showed Chester photographs of several men. "These are the key players. They recruit drivers who are in financial trouble, offering money in exchange for information about cargo shipments and route plans." Chester recognized one of the faces immediately. It was Virgil. "This man," Harrison said, pointing to Virgil's photograph, "is one of their primary recruiters. He identifies potential targets, gains their trust, and brings them into the organization. We believe he may have already made contact with you." Chester felt his world turning upside down. Either Harrison was legitimate and Virgil was a criminal, or Harrison was lying and trying to turn Chester against the one person who'd been trying to help him. "What makes you think he's contacted me?" Chester asked carefully. "Because we know he was at the same truck stop in Cheyenne the night before your brake failure. We have surveillance footage of him near your truck." Harrison showed Chester a grainy security camera image that appeared to show Virgil walking near Chester's Freightliner. "We think he sabotaged your brakes to put you in a desperate situation, then positioned himself to recruit you when you were vulnerable." Chester stared at the photograph, trying to process what he was seeing. If Harrison was telling the truth, then everything Virgil had told him was a lie. The big man hadn't been trying to help expose a conspiracy. He'd been part of it from the beginning. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because we want you to help us catch him. The next time he contacts you, we want you to play along. Agree to provide information, take his money, let him think he's successfully recruited you." Agent Parker spoke for the first time. "We'll be monitoring all your communications and meetings. When we have enough evidence to prove his involvement in the cargo theft ring, we'll move in and make arrests." "What about my safety? If this man is as dangerous as you say, won't I be putting myself at risk?" "We'll be watching you at all times," Harrison assured him. "If there's any sign of danger, we'll intervene immediately." Chester pretended to consider the offer while his mind raced. If Harrison was legitimate, then cooperating would help expose a criminal conspiracy and protect other drivers from future attacks. If Harrison was lying, then agreeing to work with him would put Chester in the middle of a criminal organization with no protection. "I'll do it," Chester said finally. "But I want that $50,000 you promised, plus a guarantee that my truck will be released and all charges dropped." "Done," Harrison said, reaching into his jacket. But instead of pulling out paperwork or a check, Harrison withdrew a small electronic device. Before Chester could react, Parker and Webb had moved to block the exits. "Actually, Mr. Vance, there's been a change of plans," Harrison said, his voice taking on a colder tone. "We've decided that you know too much to be useful as an informant." Chester felt his blood turn to ice. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you've been asking too many questions, making too many phone calls, gathering too much information. You've become a liability rather than an asset." The device in Harrison's hand was some kind of electronic stun weapon. Chester realized that he'd walked into a trap, and there was no way out.
Virgil was right about you, Chester said. You're not federal agents, you're the criminals.
Harrison smiled coldly.
Actually, we are federal agents. We just happen to have a profitable side business. The beauty of having federal credentials is that no one questions your authority or your access to information.
The cargo theft operation
is just the beginning. Do you have any idea how much money flows through the interstate trucking system? How many opportunities there are for people with the right connections and the right authority?
Agent Parker moved closer to Chester.
The problem with independent drivers like you is that you don't understand how the system really works. You think that if you follow the rules and work hard, you'll be protected. But the system protects the people who control it, not the people who depend on it.
Chester looked around the abandoned building, searching for any possible escape route. But Webb was blocking the front door, Parker was moving to cut off access to the kitchen area, and Harrison was positioning himself to use the stun weapon if Chester tried to run.
What happened to the other drivers? The ones whose brakes failed? The ones who died were just collateral damage, Harrison said matter-of-factly. We needed their cargo, and sometimes accidents happen during recovery operations. The ones who survived and kept their mouths shut were allowed to rebuild their lives. The ones who asked too many questions. He shrugged. Well, let's just say they had additional accidents. Chester realized that he was looking at psychopaths with federal badges, people who used their authority to commit crimes and eliminate witnesses without consequence. Floyd's going to talk. He has evidence. Floyd's going to have a heart attack tonight. Tragic, really. The stress of dealing with insurance investigations and criminal conspiracies. Too much pressure for an old man. Harrison raised the stun weapon. Any last words, Mr. Vance? That's when the building's lights blazed on and armed figures poured through every entrance. FBI, nobody move. Drop your weapons.
Harrison, Parker, and Webb froze as a dozen federal agents surrounded them with assault rifles drawn. The real FBI, not the corrupt agents who'd been running the cargo theft operation. Agent Harrison called out a woman in tactical gear who appeared to be in charge. You're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and multiple counts of murder. As the corrupt agents were handcuffed and led away, Chester stood in the middle of the chaos trying to understand what had just happened. Mr. Vance? The FBI team leader approached him. I'm Special Agent Rodriguez. We've been investigating this corruption case for 8 months. Your cooperation with Mr. Kowalski provided the evidence we needed to finally move against these criminals. Chester stared at her. Virgil's working with you? Mr. Kowalski is a former federal investigator who volunteered to go undercover when his partner was killed by this organization. Everything he told you about the conspiracy was true. The only thing he didn't tell you was that he was working with us to expose it. Rodriguez handed Chester a business card. You're going to need to testify in federal court, but in the meantime, all charges against you are dropped. Your truck will be returned and you'll receive full compensation for your losses. As Chester walked out of the abandoned truck stop, he saw Virgil leaning against his blue Peterbilt, smoking a cigarette and looking older than his years. Sorry about the deception, Virgil said, but we couldn't risk Harrison's people finding out about the FBI investigation. How long have you been working with them? Since they killed my partner 18 months ago. Tommy wasn't just my driving partner. He was my partner at the Bureau. We were investigating cargo theft when we got too close to the truth. Chester shook his head. So the whole thing about drivers being targeted was true? Every word of it. Harrison and his people have been stealing cargo and killing drivers for over 2 years. You would have been their next victim if we hadn't stopped them. What happens now? Now you go back to driving trucks, and I go back to my real job. And hopefully, other drivers won't have to worry about being murdered for their cargo. Chester climbed into his rental truck and drove away from the abandoned truck stop, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't really over. Harrison's organization had been exposed, but how many other corrupt agents were out there? How many other criminal conspiracies were operating under the cover of federal authority? As Chester merged onto the interstate and headed back towards Sterling, he realized that his ordeal had taught him something important about the world he lived in. The system that was supposed to protect honest, hard-working people could also be used to prey on them. Authority could be corrupted, badges could be bought, and sometimes the most dangerous criminals were the ones wearing suits and carrying federal credentials. Chester would continue driving trucks through the Rocky Mountains, but he would never again assume that a badge or a federal ID guaranteed that someone could be trusted. Because sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones you needed protection from. And sometimes the only person you could really trust was yourself. Dwayne Garrett had been driving the Montana highways for 16 years, and he'd learned to read winter weather like a farmer reads soil. The subtle shift in air pressure that meant snow was coming. The particular quality of gray that promised a serious storm. The way the wind changed direction just before all hell broke loose. That February afternoon, as Dwayne guided his Kenworth up Highway 2 toward Glacier National Park, all the signs were screaming at him to find shelter. The barometric pressure was dropping like a stone. The clouds had that heavy, pregnant look that meant feet of snow, not inches, and the wind was gusting hard enough to rock his 80,000-pound rig on the straight stretches. But Dwayne had a deadline. The load of construction equipment in his trailer was needed at a mining operation near the Canadian border first thing Monday morning. If he could push through the weather and make it to Kalispell tonight, he'd be ahead of schedule and looking at a decent paycheck for the first time in months. The CB radio had been crackling with warnings all afternoon. Other drivers pulling off, truck stops filling up, state patrol advising against unnecessary travel. Smart drivers were battening down for what the Weather Service was calling a significant winter weather event. Dwayne wasn't feeling particularly smart. "Big Sky Express, you copy?" The voice on the CB belonged to Jake Morrison, another independent driver Dwayne had known for years. "Go ahead, Jake." "Dwayne, where you at, buddy?" "Just past Browning, heading west on 2. Should make Kalispell before this thing really hits." There was a pause filled with static. "Dwayne, I'm holed up at the truck stop in Cut Bank. Weather Service just updated their forecast. They're talking about 18 to 24 inches in the next 12 hours. 60-mile-per-hour winds. This isn't a storm you want to be caught in." Dwayne looked at his GPS. Cut Bank was 40 miles behind him. Kalispell was still 60 miles ahead. Turning back would mean losing a day, maybe 2, depending on how long the storm lasted. And losing time meant losing money he couldn't afford to lose. "I appreciate the heads up, Jake, but I think I can make it through." "Dwayne, don't be stupid. This isn't worth dying over." But Dwayne had already made up his mind. He clicked off the CB and focused on the road ahead. The snow was starting to fall harder now, big, wet flakes that splattered against his windshield and reduced visibility to maybe a quarter mile. The wind was getting stronger, too, requiring constant corrections to keep the truck centered in his lane. For the first hour, things were manageable. Dwayne had good tires, plenty of experience driving in snow, and a truck that handled well in adverse conditions. The highway was still passable, though he hadn't seen another vehicle in either direction for the past 20 minutes. Then the weather turned serious. The snow went from falling to driving sideways, carried by winds that had to be pushing 70 miles per hour. Dwayne's windshield wipers were struggling to keep up, and ice was starting to build up around the edges of the glass. The road surface was disappearing under an accumulating layer of snow that made it impossible to tell where the pavement ended and the shoulder began. Dwayne slowed to 30 miles per hour, then 25. His headlights barely penetrated the whiteout conditions, and he was navigating more by instinct and the occasional glimpse of a road sign than by any clear view of the highway. That's when he felt the truck start to slide. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a subtle loosening of the connection between his tires and the road surface. But Dwayne had enough experience to know that subtle could become catastrophic very quickly. He eased off the throttle and made gentle corrections with the steering wheel, fighting the urge to overcorrect and send the rig into a jackknife. The slide lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was enough to get Dwayne's full attention. The road surface had become a sheet of ice covered by several inches of snow. In these conditions, even the best driver with the best equipment could lose control without warning. Dwayne started looking for a place to pull off and wait out the storm. But this stretch of Highway 2 offered limited options. It was mountain highway with steep grades, sharp curves, and precious few wide spots where a truck could safely park. Most of the pullouts were narrow shoulder areas that would put him dangerously close to traffic, if there had been any traffic. But there wasn't. Dwayne hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. He was alone on a mountain highway in the middle of what was rapidly becoming a historic blizzard. The CB radio crackled to life. All units be advised, Highway 2 is now closed from Browning to Kalispell due to extreme weather conditions. Repeat, Highway 2 is closed. Dwayne felt his stomach drop. The highway was closed behind him and ahead of him. He was trapped in the middle of the closure zone with nowhere to go but forward. He tried to raise the state patrol on the CB but got nothing but static. His cell phone showed no signal. The storm was interfering with radio communications, and the mountainous terrain wasn't helping. Dwayne pressed on, hoping to find a truck stop or rest area where he could wait out the storm. But the snow was falling so hard now that his headlights were almost useless. He was driving by feel, using the rumble strips on the shoulder to tell him when he was drifting off the road. That's when he saw the light. At first, he thought it was another truck, maybe someone else who'd gotten caught in the storm. But as he got closer, he realized it was stationary. A single yellow light, barely visible through the driving snow, off to his right. Dwayne slowed to a crawl and tried to get a better look. It appeared to be coming from a building of some kind, set back from the highway maybe 100 yards. As he watched, the light flickered, not like an electrical problem, but like someone was signaling. Dwayne had 2 choices. He could keep driving blind through the storm, hoping to find an official truck stop or rest area before he lost control and crashed. Or he could investigate the light and see if it offered shelter from the blizzard. The decision was made for him when his truck hit a patch of ice and started sliding toward the guardrail. Dwayne fought for control, managed to straighten out, but realized he was kidding himself if he thought he could continue driving in these conditions. He found what looked like a driveway or access road leading toward the light and carefully turned off the highway. The road was unpaved and covered with snow, but it seemed solid enough to support his truck. As he got closer to the light, he could make out the shape of a building, a cabin or maybe a small house. Dwayne parked as close as he dared and killed the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming after hours of wind and engine noise. He could hear the storm raging outside, but the cab of his truck felt like a tiny island of calm in the middle of chaos. He grabbed his heavy coat and flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face with enough force to sting. The cold was so intense it took his breath away. Dwayne struggled through the snow toward the building, following what appeared to be a path of sorts. As he got closer, he could see that it was indeed a cabin, a rustic log structure with smoke coming from the chimney and warm yellow light visible through the windows. He knocked on the door, hoping whoever lived there would be willing to offer shelter to a stranded trucker. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a woman in her 60s with gray hair and kind eyes. "My goodness," she said. "What are you doing out in this weather?" "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm a truck driver. Got caught in the storm. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call for help. Maybe wait out the worst of this weather somewhere warm." The woman looked past him toward his truck, barely visible through the driving snow. "Of course, come in. I'm Velma Patterson. This is my son Luther's cabin, but well, come in out of the cold and we'll sort this out." Dwayne stepped inside, grateful for the warmth and shelter. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace throwing heat and light into a living room furnished with handmade furniture and wool rugs. "Thank you so much," Dwayne said. "I'm Dwayne Garrett. I really appreciate this." "Not at all. Can't have you freezing to death out there." Velma closed the door behind him and gestured toward the fireplace. "Warm yourself up. I'll make some coffee." As Velma busied herself in the kitchen area, Dwayne took a closer look around the cabin. Something felt off, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The furniture was nice, but old-fashioned. There was no television visible, no computer, none of the modern conveniences you'd expect to find in a mountain cabin. But what really caught his attention were the photographs on the mantelpiece. They showed the same woman, Velma, but in different time periods. Some looked recent, others appeared to be decades old. In all of them, she looked essentially the same age. "Mrs. Patterson," Dwayne called toward the kitchen. "Do you have a phone I could use? I need to let my dispatcher know where I am." "I'm afraid we don't have phone service up here," Velma replied. "The lines came down in a storm last winter and never got repaired. Too remote," the phone company said. Dwayne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. No phone, no cell service, no way to communicate with the outside world. He was completely cut off, dependent on the kindness of strangers who lived in a cabin that felt increasingly wrong the longer he stayed in it. "When do you think this storm will pass?" Dwayne asked. "Oh, it's hard to say. Mountain weather can be unpredictable. Could be hours, could be days." Velma returned from the kitchen carrying a steaming mug of coffee. As she handed it to Dwayne, he noticed that her hands were ice cold despite the warmth of the cabin. "Where did you say your son was?" Dwayne asked. Velma's expression changed slightly, becoming more guarded. "Luther's around. He doesn't like strangers much. Keeps to himself when we have visitors." Dwayne sipped the coffee and felt warmth spreading through his chest, but the feeling of wrongness was getting stronger. Something about this situation didn't add up, and his 16 years of experience on the road had taught him to trust his instincts. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, Dwayne sat by a warm fire in a comfortable cabin with a seemingly kind woman who had offered him shelter from the blizzard. So why did he feel like he was in more danger now than he had been driving through the storm? Dwayne had been sitting by the fireplace for about an hour when he heard the footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate steps moving back and forth across the ceiling like someone pacing. Velma had said her son Luther was around but didn't like strangers. The footsteps suggested someone large and restless. "That's Luther," Velma said, following Dwayne's gaze toward the ceiling. "He'll come down when he's ready." Dwayne nodded and continued sipping his coffee, but something about the pacing bothered him. It wasn't random or casual. It was methodical, like someone walking a measured path over and over again, the kind of repetitive behavior that suggested obsession or mental instability. "How long have you lived up here?" Dwayne asked, trying to make conversation and ease the tension he was feeling. "Oh, a long time. Luther and I moved here after my husband died. Wanted to get away from people, find some peace." Velma settled into a chair across from him. "It's quiet up here, peaceful. Nobody bothers us. Must get lonely, though, especially in winter. We like it that way. People in town, they ask too many questions. Want to know things that aren't their business." Velma's voice had taken on a harder edge. "Up here, we can live how we want. Do what we need to do." The footsteps overhead stopped suddenly. In the silence that followed, Dwayne could hear the wind howling outside and the occasional crack of settling timber in the cabin. But there was something else, too. A sound he couldn't quite identify, rhythmic and muffled, like someone digging or scraping. "What's your son do for work?" Dwayne asked. "This and that. Odd jobs.
He's particular about the work he takes. Velma stood up abruptly. More coffee? Before Dwayne could answer, she was heading back to the kitchen. As she moved, Dwayne noticed something he'd missed before. The floorboards creaked under her weight,
but the sound was wrong somehow. Too hollow, like there was a space beneath the floor that shouldn't be there. Dwayne got up and walked quietly to the window, ostensibly to check on his truck, but really to get a better sense of his surroundings. Through the driving snow, he could barely make out the shape of his Kenworth, but he could see something else that made his blood run cold. There were other vehicles partially buried in the snow behind the cabin. At least 3, maybe more. They looked like they'd been there for a while, long enough for multiple storms to bury them. One appeared to be a pickup truck. Another looked like it might be a semi-tractor, though it was hard to tell with all the snow. Checking on your truck? Velma had returned with the coffee pot, but her voice was different now. Flatter, less welcoming. Yeah, just making sure it's okay out there. Dwayne turned back to her, trying to keep his expression neutral. Looks like you've had other visitors recently. I saw some vehicles out back. Velma's smile didn't reach her eyes. Oh, those old things. Luther collects them, buys old vehicles, fixes them up. It's a hobby. But the vehicles Dwayne had seen weren't project cars. They were abandoned, buried, forgotten, and at least one of them was definitely a commercial truck. Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to need to check on my rig. Make sure the engine doesn't freeze up. Dwayne started toward the door, but Velma moved to block his path. I wouldn't go out there if I were you. Storm's getting worse. Easy to get lost, even just going to your truck. People have died in weather like this, just a few yards from safety. There was something in her tone that sounded less like concern and more like a threat. Dwayne looked at her more closely and noticed things he'd missed before. Her clothes were old-fashioned but well-maintained, like she'd been wearing the same style for decades. Her hands, which had felt so cold when she'd given him the coffee, showed no signs of the kind of wear you'd expect from someone living a rough mountain life. And her eyes. In the firelight, they looked almost black. I'll just be a minute, Dwayne said, reaching for the door handle. Luther wouldn't like that. Velma's voice was barely above a whisper. He gets upset when people go places they shouldn't go. The footsteps overhead resumed, but now they were moving toward what sounded like stairs. Someone was coming down. Dwayne heard the creaking of wooden steps and turned to see a figure descending from the upper floor. Luther Patterson was a large man, probably 6.5 feet tall and built like a lumberjack. He wore work clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks and had the kind of pale, unhealthy complexion that came from spending too much time indoors. But it was his eyes that made Dwayne's skin crawl. They were the same black, empty holes that he'd noticed in his mother's face. And when Luther smiled, Dwayne could see that several of his teeth were missing. Ma, who's our guest? Luther's voice was soft, almost childlike, which made him seem even more menacing. This is Mr. Garrett. He's a truck driver who got caught in the storm. Velma's demeanor had changed completely. She was no longer the kind hostess offering shelter. She was something else entirely. Luther approached Dwayne slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. Truck driver, huh? What you hauling? Construction equipment, Dwayne said, trying to keep his voice steady. Nothing valuable, just heavy machinery. Machinery can be valuable, Luther said, especially if you know the right people to sell it to. Dwayne felt his heart rate spike. This wasn't about offering shelter to a stranded traveler. This was about robbery. The vehicles behind the cabin belonged to other drivers who'd been caught in storms, sought shelter, and never left. I should really check on my truck, Dwayne said, edging toward the door. Company policy. Need to log my position every few hours or they'll send search teams. It was a lie, but a plausible one. Luther and Velma exchanged a look that confirmed Dwayne's worst suspicions. Search teams won't be flying in this weather,
Luther said. Won't be driving either. Roads are closed for miles in every direction. Nobody's coming to look for you anytime soon. Luther, why don't you show Mr. Garrett around the cabin? Velma suggested. Show him where he'll be staying. The words sent ice through Dwayne's veins. Where he'll be staying. Not where he could stay. Where he would stay. Like it wasn't really a choice. I'd rather just wait by the fire, if that's okay, Dwayne said. I'm still pretty cold from being outside. I insist, Luther said, and there was nothing childlike about his voice now. Come on, I'll show you the basement. That's where guests usually sleep. Dwayne knew with absolute certainty that if he went into that basement, he would never come back out. Whatever Luther and Velma had planned for him, it didn't involve him leaving in the morning when the storm passed. Actually, I think I left something important in my truck, Dwayne said, lunging for the door handle. Luther moved faster than Dwayne would have thought possible for such a large man. A massive hand clamped down on Dwayne's shoulder and spun him around with enough force to send him stumbling back into the center of the room. You're not going anywhere, Luther said. Not until we're done with you. Dwayne looked around the cabin, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. The fireplace poker was within reach, but Luther was between him and the exit. Even if he could get past the big man, he'd have to make it through a blizzard to his truck, assuming it would even start after sitting in sub-zero temperatures. What do you want? Dwayne asked. Your truck, Velma said simply. Your cargo, your identification, everything that says Dwayne Garrett ever existed. And then? Luther's grin got wider, revealing more missing teeth. Then you join the others. What others? Velma gestured toward the floor. The ones downstairs. They've been real good company over the years. Real quiet. Dwayne felt his knees go weak. The hollow sound the floorboards had made when Velma walked across them. The scraping noise he'd heard from upstairs. The methodical pacing. Luther had been digging. Preparing. How many? Dwayne whispered. Enough, Luther said. Truckers mostly. Few tourists who took the wrong turn. People who won't be missed for a while, if ever. Dwayne realized that he was looking at serial killers, a mother and son team who used the isolation of their mountain cabin and the unpredictability of winter weather to prey on stranded travelers. They probably had the routine down to a science by now. The vehicle's outside, Dwayne said. Those belong to your other guests. Luther's good with vehicles, Velma said proudly. Takes them apart, sells the parts. Nothing goes to waste. And the drivers? Luther's expression became almost dreamy. They become part of the mountain, part of the forest, part of the silence up here. Dwayne knew he had to act. If he waited much longer, Luther would overpower him and drag him down to whatever nightmare waited in the basement. But the big man was blocking the only exit, and Dwayne had no idea if his truck would even start after sitting in the storm. That's when he remembered something. In his jacket pocket, he had a small emergency flare, standard equipment for truckers who might need to signal for help in remote areas. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. Okay, Dwayne said, raising his hands in apparent surrender. You win, but before you kill me, can I ask you something? Luther looked amused. What? How long have you been doing this? As Luther opened his mouth to answer, Dwayne reached into his jacket, pulled out the flare and triggered it. The cabin filled with brilliant red light and choking smoke. Luther roared in surprise and pain as the intense light hit his dilated pupils. Dwayne didn't wait to see the effect. He threw himself toward the door, fumbling with the handle as Luther thrashed around behind him, cursing and trying to clear his vision. The door flew open and Dwayne plunged into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he didn't stop. He ran through knee-deep snow toward his truck, praying that the engine would turn over and that he could get moving before Luther recovered.
Behind him, he could hear shouting from the cabin. Luther was coming after him, and despite his temporary blindness, he knew the terrain a lot better than Dwayne did. Dwayne reached his truck and yanked open the driver's door. He'd left the keys in the ignition, a habit that might just save his life. He turned the key and held his breath. The engine cranked once, twice, then caught with a roar that sounded like the most beautiful music Dwayne had ever heard. He threw the truck in gear and started moving, not caring about the snow depth or the visibility. He had to get away from the cabin and back to the highway before Luther could stop him. In his mirror, Dwayne could see a large figure stumbling through the snow behind him, but Luther was falling further behind with each second. Dwayne had escaped, but as he fought his way back through the storm toward the highway, he couldn't stop thinking about what Velma had said. The ones downstairs. They've been real good company over the years. How many drivers had stopped at that cabin seeking shelter from winter storms? How many had never been seen again? How many families were still waiting for loved ones who would never come home? And most terrifying of all, how many more Luther and Velma Pattersons were out there, using the isolation of the mountains and the desperation of stranded travelers to feed their twisted appetites? Dwayne reached the highway and turned toward Kalispell, pushing his truck as hard as he dared through the continuing storm. He had to reach civilization. He had to call the police. He had to make sure that no other drivers would ever stop at that cabin again. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't be enough. Because in the vast wilderness of the Montana mountains, there were probably dozens of cabins just like the one he'd escaped from. Dozens of Luther and Velma Pattersons waiting for the next storm to bring them fresh prey. The mountains were full of predators, and some of them walked on two legs. Dwayne had been driving for 20 minutes when he realized they were following him. At first, he thought the headlights in his mirror were just another trucker who'd gotten caught in the storm. But as he watched, the lights stayed exactly the same distance behind him, matching his speed perfectly, even though he was constantly adjusting for the road conditions. The vehicle following him wasn't struggling with the snow and ice. It was keeping pace effortlessly, like the driver knew these roads intimately. Like Luther Patterson had been driving these mountain highways his entire life. Dwayne pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck beyond what was safe for the conditions. The speedometer climbed to 40, then 45. Behind him, the headlights maintained their distance. He grabbed his CB radio and tried to raise someone, anyone who might be monitoring the emergency channels. But the storm was interfering with the signal, and all he got was static mixed with fragments of distant conversations that cut in and out. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Big Sky Express on Highway 2 eastbound. I've got a situation here. Someone is pursuing me in dangerous weather conditions." No response. The radio crackled with atmospheric interference, but no human voices came through clearly enough to understand. Dwayne checked his mirrors again. The headlights were closer now, maybe 50 yards back, and they were gaining. He tried his cell phone, hoping to get through to 911, but there was still no signal. The storm and the mountainous terrain had created a dead zone where he was completely cut off from outside help. The highway ahead curved sharply to the left, following the contour of the mountain. Dwayne took the turn as fast as he dared, feeling his trailer swing out slightly before the tires found their grip again. He was driving at the absolute limit of what was possible in these conditions. But the headlights behind him navigated the curve perfectly, closing the gap by another 10 yards. Dwayne realized that whoever was driving the pursuit vehicle had a significant advantage. They knew these roads. They'd driven them in all kinds of weather. They understood exactly how much speed they could carry through each turn, how much traction the road surface would provide, where the dangerous spots were located. More importantly, they weren't hauling 40,000 pounds of cargo. They could accelerate faster, brake more effectively, and take risks that would be suicidal in a loaded semi. The headlights were maybe 30 yards back now, and Dwayne could see that they belonged to a pickup truck. Probably four-wheel drive, definitely equipped for mountain winter driving. The kind of vehicle that Luther Patterson would use to hunt down escaped prey. Dwayne's hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. His shoulders ached from the tension of fighting to keep the truck on the road at dangerous speeds. But he couldn't slow down. If Luther caught up to him, there would be no escape the second time. The road ahead straightened out for about a mile, giving Dwayne a chance to put some distance between himself and his pursuer. But it also meant Luther would have a clear shot if he was carrying any kind of weapon. As if summoned by the thought, Dwayne heard something that made his blood freeze, a sharp crack that could only be gunfire, followed by the distinctive ping of a bullet hitting metal somewhere on his trailer. Luther was shooting at him. Dwayne swerved instinctively, nearly losing control as his trailer fishtailed in the snow. Another shot rang out, and this time he heard the bullet strike his passenger side mirror, shattering the glass. The pickup truck was closing fast now. In his remaining mirror, Dwayne could see Luther leaning out the driver's window with what looked like a hunting rifle. The man was steering with one hand and shooting with the other, displaying a level of skill that suggested he'd done this before. Dwayne realized he had to get off the highway. Staying on the straight sections was suicide. Luther would eventually land a shot that disabled the truck or killed Dwayne outright. But leaving the highway in these conditions meant risking getting stuck in deep snow or driving off a cliff. He saw a sign for a logging road coming up on the right. It wasn't much, just a narrow track that disappeared into the forest, but it might give him a chance to lose Luther in the trees. Dwayne waited until the last second, then yanked the wheel hard right. His truck plowed into the snow-covered logging road, the front wheels fighting for traction as they dug through the accumulated drifts. Behind him, he heard the pickup truck's engine roar as Luther followed him onto the secondary road. But the logging road was narrow, barely wide enough for Dwayne's truck, and the trees on both sides would limit Luther's ability to maneuver for a clear shot. The road climbed steadily into the mountains, winding between massive pine trees that blocked most of the wind and snow. For the first time since the chase began, Dwayne felt like he might have a chance. But the logging road wasn't plowed, and the snow was deep. Dwayne could feel his truck slowing down as the wheels fought for grip. The engine strained against the resistance, and he could smell the distinctive odor of an overheating transmission. In his mirror, the pickup truck was gaining again. Luther's vehicle was lighter and better suited for this kind of terrain. The gap was closing steadily. Dwayne rounded a sharp turn and saw something that made his heart skip. About a quarter-mile ahead, the logging road ended at what appeared to be a cleared area. Beyond that, nothing but forest and mountainside. He was driving into a dead end. Dwayne tried to slow down and turn around, but the road was too narrow and the snow too deep. His truck was committed to moving forward toward whatever waited at the end of the logging road. As he approached the cleared area, Dwayne could see that it was an old logging operation site. There were rusted pieces of equipment scattered around, piles of cut timber covered with snow, and what looked like the remains of a logging camp. A few abandoned buildings and some kind of loading dock. But most importantly, there were other vehicles. Dwayne saw at least 6 cars and trucks partially buried in the snow around the perimeter of the clearing. They were arranged in a rough circle, like some kind of makeshift barrier or display. This wasn't just a logging site. This was Luther's hunting ground, his killing field, the place where he brought his victims after he caught them. Dwayne parked his truck near the center of the clearing and grabbed his flashlight and tire iron from behind the seat. If he was going to die up here, he wasn't going down without a fight. The pickup truck emerged from the tree line and stopped about 50 yards away. Luther climbed out slowly, carrying his rifle with the casual confidence of a man who had done this many times before. "Should have stayed in the cabin," Luther called out. "Would have been easier for both of us." Dwayne positioned himself behind his truck, using it as cover. "How many people have you killed up here?" Luther laughed.
Lost count after 20. Been doing this for almost 15 years now. You know how many people go missing in these mountains every winter? How many never get found? The police will figure it out eventually. No, they won't. Because there's no evidence. Bodies don't last long up here. Animals, weather, time. They take care of everything. In a few months, there won't be anything left of you but bones scattered through the forest. Luther started walking toward Dwayne's truck, his rifle trained on the general area where Dwayne was hiding. Come on out. Make this easy. I promise it'll be quick. Dwayne tried to think of a way out. He could try to circle around to Luther's truck, but the man would see him coming across the open ground. He could try to run into the forest, but Luther knew these woods and Dwayne would be stumbling blind through deep snow. That's when he remembered something. His truck was equipped with an air horn loud enough to be heard for miles. If there were any search and rescue teams in the area, if anyone was monitoring emergency frequencies, the horn might bring help. Dwayne reached into his cab and laid on the air horn with everything he had. The sound echoed off the mountains, a desperate wail that spoke of mortal danger and the need for immediate assistance. Luther stopped advancing and smiled. Go ahead and make all the noise you want. Nobody's coming. Nobody even knows you're missing yet. And by the time they do, you'll be feeding the bears. But the horn blast had had an unexpected effect. From somewhere in the forest around the clearing, Dwayne heard answering sounds. Not human voices, but something else. Something that made Luther's confident expression falter. Howling. The unmistakable sound of wolves responding to what they interpreted as a territorial call. Luther's head snapped toward the tree line as the howling got closer. Shit, he muttered. Dwayne didn't understand what was happening, but he could see that Luther was suddenly nervous. The man's attention was divided between his human prey and something in the forest that posed a more immediate threat. They smell the blood, Luther said, more to himself than to Dwayne. All those bodies over the years. This whole area reeks of death to them. The howling was coming from multiple directions now, surrounding the clearing. Luther backed toward his truck, his rifle swinging between Dwayne's position and the forest. This isn't over, Luther called out. I'll be back for you. But right now, I've got bigger problems. Luther climbed into his pickup and started the engine. But instead of driving toward Dwayne to finish what he'd started, he headed back toward the logging road, fleeing from whatever was approaching through the trees. As the sound of Luther's truck faded into the distance, Dwayne found himself alone in the clearing with the approaching wolves. He climbed back into his cab and locked the doors, hoping that the pack would lose interest and move on. But as he sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the vehicles of Luther's previous victims, Dwayne realized that his ordeal was far from over. He was still trapped in the mountains during a blizzard, with no way to communicate with the outside world and no guarantee that Luther wouldn't return with reinforcements. And now he had wolves to worry about too. Dwayne started his engine and began the careful process of turning his truck around in the confined space of the clearing. He had to get back to the highway, had to find help, had to make sure that Luther Patterson was stopped before he killed again. But as he maneuvered between the abandoned vehicles, Dwayne caught glimpses of what was inside some of them. Personal belongings scattered on seats and dashboards, clothing hanging from rear-view mirrors, the accumulated detritus of lives cut short by a madman who used winter storms as accomplices in murder. Dwayne made it back to the logging road and began the treacherous drive back toward the highway. Behind him, the wolves had emerged into the clearing, their dark shapes moving between the abandoned vehicles like ghosts from Luther's bloody past. As Dwayne finally reached the highway and turned toward the distant lights of Kalispell, he couldn't stop thinking about all the families who were still waiting for loved ones to come home. All the people who had no idea that their missing relatives were buried somewhere in the Montana wilderness, victims of a killer who used their own desperation for shelter against them. Dwayne had escaped, but how many others wouldn't be so lucky?
How many more storms would Luther Patterson use to add to his grotesque collection of abandoned vehicles and forgotten victims? The storm was finally beginning to clear, but Dwayne knew that the real nightmare was just beginning. Because somewhere behind him in those dark mountains, Luther Patterson was planning his next hunt. And winter in Montana was far from over. Dwayne reached Kalispell at 3 in the morning, his truck coated with ice and his nerves shattered from the night's ordeal. The first thing he did was drive straight to the police station, where he spent 4 hours giving a statement to skeptical officers who had trouble believing his story. Serial killers operating out of a remote mountain cabin, bodies buried in a basement, abandoned vehicles used as trophies, a chase through the mountains that ended in a clearing full of wolves and the remnants of previous victims. Detective Morrison, the lead investigator assigned to the case, listened patiently, but Dwayne could see the doubt in his eyes. Without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, it sounded like the ravings of a man who'd been traumatized by getting lost in a blizzard. "Mr. Garrett, I want to be clear that we're taking your statement seriously," Detective Morrison said. "But you have to understand that what you're describing is highly unusual. We'll need to verify your claims before we can mobilize a search team." "Those people are killers," Dwayne insisted. "They've been preying on stranded travelers for years. There are bodies buried under that cabin. And we'll investigate those allegations. But we have to wait for the weather to clear before we can access the area you're describing. Highway 2 is still closed, and we're not sending officers into the backcountry during an active blizzard." Dwayne left the police station feeling frustrated and exhausted. He checked into a motel and tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Luther's black, empty stare and heard Velma's voice talking about the guests who'd become part of the mountain. The next morning, Dwayne called his dispatcher to report his status and explain why his delivery would be delayed. But when he tried to describe what had happened, he found himself editing the story, leaving out the most unbelievable parts. Even to his own ears, it sounded like something from a horror movie. "Storm got bad," he told his dispatcher. "Had to take shelter. Lost some time, but I'll have the load delivered today." It was technically true, just not complete. Dwayne was beginning to understand why Luther and Velma had been able to operate for so long without being caught. Who would believe such a story without proof? 3 days later, when the weather finally cleared enough for an investigation, Detective Morrison called Dwayne with an update. "We found the cabin," Morrison said, "and we found evidence that supports parts of your story." "What kind of evidence?" "The basement you described. There were remains. We're still processing the scene, but preliminary examination suggests multiple victims over several years." Dwayne felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that he'd been believed. Horror at the confirmation that Luther and Velma had been killing people for years. "What about Luther and Velma? Did you arrest them?" There was a long pause. "Mr. Garrett, that's where things get complicated. We didn't find any current occupants at the cabin, and the remains we found, they're old. Very old." "What do you mean?" "The forensic anthropologist estimates that some of the bodies have been there for decades, maybe longer. We're talking about skeletal remains that predate the time frame you described for your encounter." Dwayne felt ice forming in his stomach. "That's impossible. I was there 3 days ago. I talked to them. They chased me through the mountains." "I believe you had that experience, Mr. Garrett, but we need to figure out who you actually encountered, because the evidence suggests that whoever's been killing people at that cabin has been dead for a very long time." Detective Morrison continued. "We found records in the cabin that helped us identify some of the remains. Driver's licenses, vehicle registrations, personal effects. The most recent victims we can definitively identify disappeared over 20 years ago." Dwayne's mind was reeling. "But I saw them. I talked to them. Luther shot at me." "Did you get a good look at the pickup truck that chased you? License plate, distinctive features, anything we could use to track it down?" Dwayne tried to remember details from the pursuit, but everything had happened so fast in the dark and snow. It was a pickup, dark-colored, maybe 10 or 15 years old, but I didn't see the license plate. We'll keep looking. But Mr. Garrett, I have to ask you something. Is it possible that you were suffering from hypothermia or exhaustion? Sometimes extreme cold and stress can cause hallucinations that seem completely real. Dwayne wanted to argue, but doubt was creeping in. The whole experience had been surreal. The cabin appearing out of nowhere, the old-fashioned furnishings, Velma's cold hands and ageless appearance in the photographs. The more he thought about it, the more dreamlike it seemed. "I know what I saw," Dwayne said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not questioning your honesty, but we need to consider all possibilities. Extreme weather conditions can affect perception and memory in ways that people don't realize." After ending the call, Dwayne sat in his motel room trying to make sense of what he'd learned. The cabin was real, the bodies were real, but the people he'd encountered might not have been. He drove back to the area where he'd turned off Highway 2, looking for the access road that led to the cabin. But in daylight, with the snow cleared and the landscape visible, nothing looked familiar. He found several logging roads and cabin driveways, but none of them matched his memory of that night. After 2 hours of searching, Dwayne found a road that led to what appeared to be the right general area. He followed it to a clearing where he could see the remains of an old cabin, partially collapsed and obviously abandoned for years. Police vehicles were still on scene, and Detective Morrison was supervising the excavation of what appeared to be a basement area beneath the ruined structure. "Mr. Garrett," Morrison called out when he saw Dwayne approaching. "I was hoping you'd come back. I wanted you to see this." Morrison led him to the excavation site. "We've recovered remains from at least 18 different individuals. Based on the personal effects we've found, they were truckers, tourists, hikers, people who probably sought shelter during winter storms over a period of about 30 years." Dwayne stared into the excavated basement. The space was smaller than he remembered, and the cabin above it was clearly uninhabitable. Roof partially collapsed, walls rotting, no heat or electricity. "The killing stopped about 20 years ago," Morrison continued. "That's when the most recent victims date from. Our theory is that whoever was responsible either moved away, died, or was arrested for other crimes. But I was here 3 days ago. I sat by a fire. I drank coffee. There was electricity, heat, furniture." Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Mr. Garrett, extreme hypothermia can cause very vivid hallucinations. Your brain was probably trying to create a survival scenario, warmth, shelter, other people. The mind is incredibly powerful when it comes to self-preservation." Dwayne wanted to argue, but the evidence was overwhelming. The cabin was a ruin. There was no way anyone could have been living there. No way he could have spent hours in a warm, comfortable room. "So what really happened to me? Our best guess is that you got disoriented in the storm, possibly suffered some hypothermia, and took shelter in your truck until the weather passed. The hallucinations filled in the gaps in a way that felt completely real." Dwayne looked around the clearing one more time. In daylight, he could see that there were indeed several abandoned vehicles scattered through the trees, but they were rusted hulks that had been there for decades, not the relatively recent acquisitions he thought he'd seen. "What about the chase? The shooting?" "We found tire tracks consistent with your truck leaving the highway and returning, but no evidence of a pursuit vehicle. The damage to your mirror could have been caused by ice or debris during the storm." Dwayne touched the broken mirror. In his memory, he could still hear the crack of Luther's rifle, still feel the terror of being hunted through the mountains. But maybe Morrison was right. Maybe his mind had created an elaborate fiction to explain a simpler reality. "We are grateful that you reported this," Morrison said.
Even if your experience wasn't what you thought it was, you led us to a significant crime scene. These families deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. As Dwayne drove away from the ruined cabin, he tried to convince himself that Morrison's explanation made sense. Hypothermia, hallucinations, his mind creating a story to fill in gaps in his memory. But deep down, Dwayne knew what he'd experienced. He remembered the taste of Velma's coffee, the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace, the weight of Luther's hand on his shoulder. He remembered details that were too vivid, too specific to be hallucinations. Most of all, he remembered the photographs on the mantelpiece, pictures of Velma taken across decades, showing her at the same apparent age. 3 weeks later, Dwayne was back on the road, hauling freight through the Montana mountains. He'd requested routes that avoided Highway 2, but eventually work requirements forced him back through that area. This time, he drove straight through without stopping, even when the weather started to deteriorate. He kept his CB radio on the emergency channel and his cell phone charged. He carried extra food, water, and emergency equipment. But as he passed the area where he'd turned off that night, Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. In his mirror, he caught glimpses of what might have been headlights following at a distance. When he stopped for fuel, he saw a dark pickup truck at the edge of the parking lot, too far away to see the driver clearly. Detective Morrison had said that the killing at the cabin stopped 20 years ago. But what if he was wrong? What if Luther and Velma Patterson had simply moved their operation? What if they were still out there, using winter storms to trap new victims? Dwayne never found answers to those questions. But he never forgot that night in the mountains, and he never again sought shelter from strangers during winter storms. Because some risks weren't worth taking. Some people weren't worth trusting. And some stories, even when they couldn't be proven, contained truths that were too important to ignore. The mountains were vast and full of hiding places. And somewhere in that wilderness, Dwayne was convinced that predators still prowled the storm-swept highways, waiting for the next desperate traveler to seek shelter from the cold. Waiting for the next victim to trust the wrong people at the wrong time. Waiting for winter to bring them fresh prey.